Hey everyone, we'll get back to the podcast in a second, but first I have a new novel out, Holtman Arms. It follows Colvin Hall, an aspiring writer who decides to write a romance novel on a whim, sends it to a publisher, and it becomes a huge success. The only problem is, no one knows it's him because he writes under the pen name Mary Ballantyne. With all of the money and none of the fame, Colvin longs for the world to recognize his accomplishments. When he gets an opportunity to write a freelance article on a washed-up 90s pop star looking for a comeback, that recognition starts to come, but is it all he hoped for? It doesn't matter because he's getting it whether he likes it or not. Holtman Arms is the second in my author's cycle after A Girl and a Gun, and like that previous novel, it explores themes of success and accomplishment in the 21st century. You can buy it now through Amazon in paperback or on Kindle. The link is in the podcast description. As always, thanks for your support.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Direct-to-Video Connoisseur Podcast. As always, this is Matt here, and I am joined once again by a guest that we've had on before, Tom Jolliffe. Welcome back, Tom.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me back.
Excellent. We also other special guests this time around. We've got Nathan Shepka, who is Tom's partner when they made the film When Darkness Falls. So welcome, Nathan.
Cheers, man. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and both of you are going to be talking about a crowdsourcing campaign that you're going to be having for a new movie, Baby in the Basket. But I figured maybe before we get into that, we'll kind of talk a little bit about When Darkness Falls.
Yeah, cool. Sounds good.
Yeah, and I think when we had Tom on in the summer, he was kind of talking about it from his standpoint of, writing the film, but also kind of sort of being in contact with you, Nathan, about sort of what you were doing on the ground when you were making that film. And I know one of the things he mentioned about it was that in a way, sort of COVID actually kind of helped you a little bit in making that movie because you had a lot of locations that you could work with.
Yeah, I mean, it was a weird one. It was obviously made during quite an unusual time. What we actually did was we bubbled. So the cast and crew bubbled in two cottages in a village called One Look Head in Scotland, which is actually the highest village in Scotland, but it's not in the Highlands like you would expect. It's actually only about a 40-minute drive from Glasgow. So we had a great location there. We stayed in two cottages, and those kind of doubled up as locations as well. But yeah, I mean, imagine, the cities were quiet at that period, but, we could spend entire days down in One Look Head and not pass another soul. It was literally that quiet. So it was a bizarre experience, but in a way it kind of adds to the eeriness and the atmosphere of the film itself. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved about When Darkness Falls, and I was telling Tom about this, was that like there's this sort of this expansiveness of the Highlands, and you're kind of using the landscape kind of with like drone footage and sort of really giving this really big open space. And then just sort of going back to the title, When Darkness Falls, when it's dark, suddenly that atmosphere becomes extremely claustrophobic, and I really like that dichotomy there, that juxtaposition.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to do something like that again, because I think, yeah, you're right. The irony or the sort of oxymoron there is that, there's this huge expanse, but they're essentially trapped there. And I think one of the things that I did when I was thinking about shot lists and stuff like that was to kind of put yourself in the situation of what's actually more terrifying than being chased through some dark alley in Glasgow would be getting chased along a country road in the dead of night, or even during the day when no one's about. So yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and it's hopefully one that we'll explore again on some level.
Yeah, and yeah, one of the things Tom mentioned was that because that area, some of those areas that you were in generally have like a lot of tourists, and you have sort of tour groups and things like that, and that not having that, it kind of helps because some of the more sinister things that the characters are doing, if there's tour groups or if there's people in the area, it kind of ruins the sort of the cover that they would have been good. Like it makes them much more conspicuous in what they're doing.
Yeah, two girls being chased by two creepy guys in the middle of nowhere. I'm sure they're used to seeing that all the time. um, but yeah, no, and it's I guess we were probably doing it in such a quiet time that we you usually get some sort of, I don't want to say public interference, but you can't stop traffic and you can't tell people not to go about their business. But in terms of logistics shoot wise, it was the interruptions were basically non-existent.
Yeah, and from a story standpoint, was that something where like you sort of had the basic idea for what you wanted the film to be, and then did it kind of evolve a bit as you were there and were on the ground and kind of got a better sense of things, or was it kind of more that you were able to kind of take advantage of it and get the story that you wanted?
Well, the idea for the film, actually, I wouldn't say it's a remake as such. It's almost like a reimagining or a slight homage to a British film called And Soon the Darkness, which was from the 70s, and it was set in France, and it was two British girls that were on a cycling holiday. It was also remade, actually. I think it was 2010 with Carol Urban and She Who Shall Not Be Named, Amber Heard. But I haven't actually seen that one. I'm assuming that's set in the States. But that was kind of the premise, and then we took it off in a kind of completely different direction because the original's probably considered quite tame by today's standards, and it wasn't as twisty. But I think I'd gone down to scout the location a few times, so Tom was writing the script as I was doing this. So once we kind of got the basic premise there, you start to imagine areas that you're going to shoot in, what you're going to do. And we did jump around. There's two towns. There's one called Wanlock Head, and then there's one called Lead Hills next to it, which was sort of famous for lead mining. And those two towns were used extensively, but also the kind of hills and the areas around it. So I guess it was just a case of me going down, looking at them and going, this is how we piece it together. Because I guess, it's all right, Tom, writing the script and, you come up with the general idea of it, but then you have to take it and go down there and see that you can actually get it to fit. And, the two places that we shot actually were perfect for the script. We changed very little, I think, from the original script.
Yeah, it's funny, and you mentioned the Carl Urban movie. I actually did see that. I actually reviewed it for the site a while back, and I didn't even make the connection between the two films. What happened was just kind of give you a quick background was that Netflix, when they were first doing their streaming, they had a contract with Starz, one of the cable movie companies here in the US, and there was a whole bunch of movies that they had. And then when that contract went away, they were going to get rid of all those movies really quickly, and I had to like watch as many as I could. And so that was one of them that I watched. But yeah, to be honest, part of the reason I think why I didn't catch it, and the film took place in Argentina, so it was a similar. Okay. Yeah, but a similar idea kind of from what you were talking about. The only difference is that I think, and I don't want to give away too much of When Darkness Falls, but I think there was more intrigue in When Darkness Falls than there was in Soon the Darkness. I think that there was also kind of more of that slow burn element that I think that you were able to pull off much better in the execution. In Soon the Darkness was kind of more your standard kind of paint by numbers sort of deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the original, I can't comment having not seen the remake, but the original of that is quite slow burn. In fact, it's probably too slow burn. I think towards the end of the second act, you're kind of like, what's actually going to happen here? But I think pacing wise, ours is quite similar to the original, but then we obviously kind of dial it up to Nicolas Cage level of madness towards the end, which I think you need. Even people that enjoy sitting through thrillers, I think audience payoff is very, very important. And, I feel like that's the thing that's missing from a lot of direct-to-video movies, whether that's budget or time constraints or, one and the other kind of have a knock-on effect. But I think it's important to try and give the audience a bit of a payoff. So even although the film's kind of slow burn for the first hour and a bit, we wanted to kind of ramp up the gore at the end.
Yeah, which I think definitely I think you're right. The payoff is definitely there. I think it's one of those things. I think you're right that a lot of moviegoers, especially when you're talking about like low budget direct to video movies or independent films, that there's almost a lack of trust from the audience that like they it's almost like there's a sense that like or maybe a lack of trust in the audience. Maybe that's the better way to say it, that distributors expect a payoff immediately for that the audience isn't going to trust the filmmakers that the payoff will be there. And that's one thing I did like about When Darkness Falls, is that it trusts the audience, that the audience is going to stick around and kind of see it happen. I do think though that you also give enough at the earlier on. I mean, I think the scene at the pub where your character is there, and we know kind of the sinister things that your character is planning to do. There is that intrigue and that sort of that tension there that even in a slow burn, I think it keeps the interest for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we'd originally discussed because AVOD audiences are particularly kind of frivolous and they'll switch from one thing to another. I mean, if you're watching a movie for free and you're not kind of vibing with it after the first 5 or 10 minutes, all you've really invested is 5 or 10 minutes. You haven't invested any money. So for AVOD audiences, we did kind of debate. So obviously the film starts off with the two guys and a bit of background on them and what sort of sordid dealings they've been up to, and then it flicks to the foot chase, and then after the titles, we introduce the main characters of Jess and Andrea. But I think we kind of contemplated cutting that original scene and just starting with the chase, which I think might have suited AVOD audiences a little bit more. But I think you then lose that sort of sinister nature of the guys walking into the pub, because that would technically be the first time you see them, and you would be thinking, okay, what are these guys all about? But the fact that we've already introduced them and kind of built up that sense of danger there, I think probably serves that scene better. But it was kind of against my better judgment that we didn't take that scene out. But it's a strange one, because actually a few people have said that that's one of their favourite scenes in the film, is that sort of 5 minute opening just with these two guys talking about this utter debauchery that they've been up to. So it's personal preference, I suppose, on some level, but you never really know how people are going to react to a film. And I think that sticking with it, obviously, especially in this digital age, is very, very important.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because I also liked that scene because I think it really establishes, the Nate character that you were playing and the Tommy character. It really established the hierarchy between those two characters, and even sort of like the sense of like who's really running things, but also like sort of maybe who's doing these things against their better judgment, and all of that stuff comes into play in that pub scene later when Jess and Andrea are there. I think if we hadn't had that scene, I guess we could have potentially from the foot chase understood essentially where the hierarchy is between those two characters. But I think the conversation established it even better of just sort of what their goal was in doing that.
Yeah. No, I think so.
And to be honest, I think it's a little bit more sinister when you think about the fact that the two characters are really in Scotland to sort of rob houses, right? That's what they're really doing, is to try to, take advantage of the fact that maybe some of the people living in those areas are more naive, and that there's money to be had, and that there's almost an opportunist element to them drugging women. And that's something that's sort of like an ancillary thing that I think in Tommy's case, he's almost like, why are we even doing this? Because it's sort of, putting us in jeopardy more and, part of the game. Whereas it kind of gives us a sense of Nate's character that he's kind of just sort of all out, kind of more of a degenerate type of character, but still is like the leader of the two.
Yeah, I think it's probably quite a risky thing to do these days, is to have so much focus on what essentially are serial date rapists in the film. And I don't want to give too much away. Nate sort of both of the characters in some way, I suppose, kind of redeem themselves, one in a slightly different way from the other. But I think with today's kind of woke, slightly more sensitive audiences, it would probably be considered quite risky to devote that much screen time or that much focus to something like that. But I think some of the reviews and the comments that I've been reading, a lot of people kind of appreciate the sort of darker nature of it, but it's meant to be disturbing. It's obviously, it's not based on reality or anything, it's fiction, but it is meant to be disturbing, because that's essentially what a horror film is there to do, whether that's through gore or psychological horror or just the sort of nature of the plot.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think, and I don't know enough about this, but I mean, I think of myself like if I would to be an actor, and I get a script and they're, it says, okay, your character is going to be a serial date rapist who's also robbing houses in Scotland. That I might be like, boy, I don't know if I want to play that part. I don't know if I want to get that dark. Whereas maybe for you being the person who's having it, who's producing the film, who's having a big part in making it, and directing the movie, that like you can kind of say like, okay, I'll take the fall and I'll be that character, and I kind of know what that character is supposed to be and who he's supposed to be. That I don't know if it's easier to find someone to play that part when it's you playing it as opposed to trying to get an actor to do it.
I think when the writer names the two guys, Nate and Tommy, you do start to ask a few questions of yourself. But no,
Yeah.
it's a weird one because someone said to me, I think this was years ago. I was cutting a show reel for her, and she had said something about could we remove either a section of it because she had played a junkie or this person that was addicted to drugs. And I think either she was asking for it to be removed, or I think she told me that someone turned her down for this commercial, which was a family-orientated commercial based on that piece being in her show reel. Now, this is obviously at sort of, I don't want to say amateur level, but we're not talking Hollywood here. And I thought that was a really weird thing because for someone's show reel, that shows range and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, well, not everybody can just play the same parts over and over again. To not give someone a job based on a part that they'd previously played. So that kind of did come into my head. But to be perfectly honest, I would probably play just about anything. I mean, I think that the more kind of challenging the role, possibly in terms of moral compass, but just in general, the more appealing that it is. And I think me going from I tend to most of the time play the good guy. It was interesting to go for a character that he wasn't out and out bad. He's not an anti-hero. He's not out and out bad. But I'm fascinated by the different shades of grey. And recently I've started shooting another film, which is a crime thriller about sex trafficking. And you're literally asking people to play pedophiles, and you're thinking, I would not be surprised if people turn down this role based on that because they were uncomfortable with that. But actually, what I tend to find is that people are champing at the bit to play roles like that because they are a bit different. And I think certainly if you're at sort of Leonardo DiCaprio level, you could probably play anything and it wouldn't damage your career. I'm not about to put a show reel and try and get, commercial work. Someone keeps casting me in these movies. I don't know who it is. But, to me, it's all a challenge. And this is the problem. A lot of people can't disconnect from reality these days in fiction, because people will turn around and say stuff like, oh, that film's racist or that character's racist, and you're like, yes, but it's fiction. The character's meant to be like that. You're trying to tell a story. You're not morally saying that racism is okay or anything like that. But stories like 12 Years a Slave, yeah, obviously there are going to be elements of racism and they are racist characters. So to me, playing a rapist or whatever, playing a serial killer, whatever part it is, it's fiction at the end of the day, and people just need to be able to detach reality from a character that you play in a film.
Yeah, that's a really great point. 'Cause my wife is a big fan of a lot of different like TV shows, and it's interesting the way that like especially younger audiences interact with TV shows now, where it's like they expect all the characters to be perfect, and if the characters have nuance to them, or if they're not always good, right? If they do things that are bad at times, and there is some sort of gray area in their characters, the people on Reddit don't want that, or the younger generations on Reddit, they don't want that. They just want somebody who's like really nice that they can root for all the time. And I think to your point, like that is an interesting thing that I think for older audiences, thinking watching 90s independent films where that period of time was really great. And I know my wife talks about a movie that I've watched with her called Happiness, that Todd Solondz movie, where you have a pedophile in that movie where main character does that, and they deal with that issue in the film. And I think that's part of the reason why that film probably isn't as big of an independent film, despite the cast and the performances and everything. That it's those are subjects people don't want to deal with in a film. But at the same time, the movie itself was compelling, and it was an entertaining watch. And that was just one of many pieces of the film.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, some of the most compelling, TV shows and films, you've got the polar opposites here. But if you look at some of the kind of the heroes back in the day, you've got Martin Riggs from Lethal Weapon. He's a suicidal maniac. You've got John McClane from Die Hard. He's this washed-up kind of alcoholic cop. None of these what makes these characters interesting is that they're not perfect, and I think that sort of polished, almost photoshopped version of characters is not particularly appealing. Not to me anyway. As you say, modern audiences seem to want characters to just be perfect, and I think that's where the kind of the superhero thing is going. But on the flip side of that, you watch stuff like the Dahmer series from Netflix, and it's just so utterly compelling. I mean, the lead in it is obviously the bad guy because they're telling something that actually happened, but bizarrely, the guy, I can't remember the guy's name, but the performance is so good, you actually almost found yourself, or at least I did, sympathizing with the character. And that's truly a great piece of acting there. And to turn that role down because of what it is, versus putting in a performance like that, it's all about what's compelling, and let's leave what's right or wrong to real life.
Yeah, and I mean, even with Dahmer, I think, there could be cases to be made that, watching that movie, there were things that happened. There were victims that could have been saved had, the police intervened better in certain circumstances. That it's almost like, one of the things here in America, there's a whole kind of issue about education and what children should be taught in school and things like that, and wanting to avoid certain, bad elements of America, or, not so nice elements of American history, and wanting to sort of gloss over those. But I think like the Dahmer thing is a situation where, like, okay, people could kind of learn from, like, okay, when you see certain things happening out on the street, maybe it's not something to ignore, or maybe it's not the the first instinct that you have about it, or something to dismiss. So that's the other piece too, right? Is that, like, it's uncomfortable to watch something like Dahmer because, like you said, the subject matter initially is not something that, and my wife watched Dahmer and she was telling me all about it, and I was kind of like, oh, I don't want to hear about this. I don't want to know about that situation. But you're right. It's like, it's a compelling kind of movie, but also I think it is something that sometimes that darker side of things, it's important to sort of understand it, because it sort of living in a bubble and not, knowing that those kinds of things happen. I think when hopefully nobody has to encounter any of that kind of thing, but it at least makes people more aware of sort of what goes on.
Yeah, I think Dahmer, obviously, I mean, that was obviously reality, so this is probably not intended, but I thought that there was almost a bit of social commentary in there with regards to kind of modern life, because the guy was obviously, suffered from this abject loneliness because he was a bit odd, he was a bit of an outcast from society. And I think that stuff like, social media and the internet is kind of leading people to be a bit more reclusive. And, I can see kind of parallels between that and kind of modern day. So I think at the same time, it kind of did it had something to say. I think not just from the perspective of what can be learnt from it on on the side of the police, like you mentioned, but also in terms of people being outcast from society, and watching these people. And it's all about mental health at the end of the day. I mean, a lot of the school shooters and stuff like that in the States, they'd lived either very traumatic lives or they were kind of broken people, and that's the kind of element that I found fascinating about Dahmer, was what kind of drove him to do that.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. That I think you're right. Like, you kind of, like you said, like, I think, my wife and I were talking about this recently about, in the 90s and into the 2000s, open mic nights were a huge thing, especially here in the United States. You go to a bar or pub or a cafe or something, and people would read spoken word poetry. And we were kind of more joking about how it was kind of insufferable. But the thing is, nowadays, right, you can do that kind of thing just by, like, posting a TikTok video or posting it on Twitter, like you said, or just being on Twitter and just posting your opinion or something like that, where in the past you really had to put yourself out there for that kind of thing. And almost kind of like coming back to what we were talking about with the acting piece of it, is that, like you said, that there's almost a sense of people being afraid to put themselves out there because of what the reaction might be, right? That, like, I don't want to play a pedophile in a movie because I don't want the reaction of what people will think of me playing that character. Whereas on the other hand, if you take that chance and you hit it out of the park, you do a really great job with it. It shows a range that somebody has, right? That nobody's saying that this person is this bad person, but yeah, I think I guess because over time there's been those stigmas, that people who play villains on TV shows. I remember there was a musician who was on Beverly Hills 90210, who wanted to leave the show so he could pursue his music career. And they said, okay, well, we're going to have you be an abusive boyfriend to Don, the character Donna. And there's a scene where he throws her down the stairs, and her theatrical fall down the stairs is kind of known to be a kind of a joke here in America. But also he was vilified for being abusive. And so when he would do his concerts, kids would go to the shows and yell at him for being being horrible. And it ended up killing his music career. So there is sometimes that backlash to it as well. So it is kind of taking a chance when somebody plays a part like that.
Yeah, it's bizarre because I remember reading an article. So we've got a soap in the UK called Coronation Street, and every few years they have a sort of serial killer on it. The usual thing that happens. There's been about 20 serial killers from this one street in Manchester or whatever. But I remember one of them saying there was this old woman that sort of said in the middle of the street, "I think that's terrible what you did to so and so." And he's like, that's me just playing a part in Coronation Street, and I'm not actually a serial killer. So it's totally bizarre that people actually react in that way. But it kind of goes back to something Tom said to me a while ago. He's like, social media, before, like you say, people had to get up at open mic nights, or they had to go out in the street and protest, or, do something ridiculous to get noticed. But social media has sort of given a platform to everybody, whether people want to hear from them or not, and, especially the idiots. So I think that's kind of where all the cancel culture has come from, and that's where all the people that are, picking up things that people said on the internet 15 years ago and trying to cancel them. And I'm not saying that being abusive or whatever is right, but I think that people take offense so easily to things that are said on the internet, and that doesn't just extend to characters played in films, but it's people making a joke, an off the cuff comment. There's a lot of people out there that have said things that have kind of been unjustly cancelled, or in inverted commas, or their career has fallen by the wayside because of some silly remark that they made on Twitter. So it's weird. It's strange times that we're living in. And I don't mean to come across as a sort of right wing lunatic when I'm saying this, but at the end of the day, you got to put it into perspective and go, that was a joke, or listen, is it really a bit dramatic to cancel this guy and ruin this guy's career because he's got an opinion that you don't agree with? It's crazy.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think you're right. Like when you're, especially for, when you're making independent films and you're sort of, you want to have three-dimensional characters, because I think that's kind of what makes the movies work, right? Is that the movies don't have the budget to have kind of the Marvel. It's easy for a Marvel movie, right, to be very black and white and not worry about having any nuance in their films, right? Because they've got hundreds of millions of dollars that they can throw at making it look nice. So they don't need to worry about that nuance. But an independent film needs, I mean, again, When Darkness Falls, it needed the nuance, right, of the characters in it for it to work. And yeah, you can't be afraid as a filmmaker to offend somebody. Go ahead.
You got to be so careful with what you're writing. I mean, I remember there's a line in a film that I've got coming out later on in the year. It's just like a sort of like standard action movie, but they're in this sort of big glass house and they spot a strike team coming from the front, and one of the guys goes, "I'll check the rear," and my character goes, "Said the Archbishop to the choir boy," which is obviously quite a dark kind of joke, but it's just a sort of off-the-cuff comment. And I remember texting Tom and going, "Do you think I can put that in there?" And Tom was like, yeah, that'll be fine. But, when you actually think of the context and the suggestion there, and it's such a simple, it's sort of one of those, old school jokes, the things that people say, "Said the Archbishop to the choir boy," or, "That's what she said," kind of thing. Right. But, the fact that I was second guessing that is a testament to what's going on, and I was questioning whether to put that in there or not, but it's in there, so
yeah. But I won't take the blame if you get any backlash.
Well, see, that's the additional writing credit, Tom. It was literally just that one line that I was referring to.
That's how you get away with it. Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned Coronation Street, because I know Michaela Longden from When Darkness Falls. It shows that she did that. I imagine that's probably one of those kind of shows that people like, they get small parts in or something, kind of sort of as they're building their CV up as actors.
Yeah, and equally, I think there's some kind of old school British faces that, randomly pop up on it for a few episodes, and you think, what are they doing in that? But yeah, it's one of those things. I think it
It's
first
like a
went out
full
in
circle thing, isn't it? Start
yeah,
there, do your thing, and then come back.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's been around for what, like 60 odd years now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. We have some that have been around that. Like the soap opera industry in the United States has almost completely fallen off. Like when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, like there were 3 hours of soap operas on the three major channels every day, and now it's like I think each of them has like maybe one survivor that's made it so far. But
Yeah. So do you guys class something like Dallas as a soap opera? Is that what you would class as a soap opera?
so that would be called a nighttime soap, or like a primetime soap, and then you have like
Right.
the daytime ones would be like General Hospital's one that's been around for like about 60 years, or Days of Our Lives, and those would be on. The idea was supposed to be that women who were stay at home, homemakers, they would watch those in the afternoons before the kids got home from school. And then then the nighttime soaps, you'd have like Dallas. 90210 was an interesting one because it was like a nighttime soap, but it was targeted more towards teens. So it was a kind of a more unique one there.
Right. Okay. We've got, I mean, most of ours, you got some late afternoon ones, but most of ours are evening ones, just so that the wife can force the husband to watch them as well. Uh, don't cancel me for that. Um,
So it's funny. I know I'm probably verging on cancel conversation as well here, but we have a lot of reality shows like Real Housewives of whatever location, New Jersey, stuff like that. And apparently the company that makes, or the TV channel that makes them, Bravo here, they do actually try to get the women to be in like more suggestive clothing at certain times, because the idea is supposed to be that will keep the husbands interested in sort of allowing, not fighting with their wife over who's going to watch the channel at that time. So there is something to that here in the U.S. that they have a similar strategy in mind of trying to get both people in the relationship to watch the show.
yeah. I mean, we've probably got stuff like that as well, like Love Island and whatnot, but that seems to be watched by, guys and girls. So
Yeah.
yeah, reality TV is obviously a massive thing. Hopefully something I never get involved in. But if the budding film career takes a nosedive, you might find me on 9 p.m. reality TV in a bikini.
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think one of the things about reality TV is it's a little bit more scripted than normal. But it is, I think, one of the things with reality TV is that it does kind of lessen the pool for, I think, like budding actors and actresses who are trying to find work that, if it used to be that more TV, there were more TV programs for them to, for people to get their starts in. And I don't know if you find when you're casting for some of your more independent things that you're more likely to find people that are kind of just looking for something, that just that need something because there isn't as much out there.
Yeah. I mean, I know that a lot of people, certainly in the UK ones, they seem to, go on these reality shows as a way of kind of kickstarting their career, whether they want to be an actor or a model or whatnot. I mean, a lot of it these days, to be honest, it's a little bit kind of cynical, but a lot of, the stuff that's happening relies not on, I don't want to say not on talent, but, the number of followers you've got on Instagram seems to be almost as important as, talent, which is sad in a way, but it's just sort of like a snapshot of, I guess, the times that we live in, and this, what people put weight in. I mean, I remember watching a guy, I don't know if this was a sort of parody or if the guy was being deadly serious, but is it Dr. Phil, the guy with the moustache?
Yes, yeah.
There's a guy on that talking about he doesn't speak to his family because they don't have enough followers on Instagram or whatever. I'm thinking, geez, what is the point?
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things I think with kind of direct to video and independent films or lower budget films, that in America at least there's sort of a cynical element to them, and I think one of them is we think of this company this run by a producer, Randall Emmett, who it seems like a lot of his movies are like, let's just find whatever actor is between projects and get them in for 60 grand or whatever to do a couple days of filming or whatever, and then just round out the cast. And one of the things I know is he was dating a reality star. Her name was Lala Kent, and she would appear in these movies. And it was just like, I'm going to have her in here with playing a sheriff or something like that. And of course, it's completely out of place. But he's just like, no, I'm going to put her in the movie. And I think that's one of the things I think when it comes to for me at least, when Tom first came to me about When Darkness Falls, that it's like when there's sort of something that's really earnest, that's being made, in an earnest way, that's not sort of like this sort of assembly line, like let's get it out there. I think there is a sense of like wanting to sort of champion it, right? Or like in your case, like okay, well, let's not get a few big reality stars so we just have a face on the tin, but let's like give some actors who are looking for something a chance to really stretch and do something big and take chances and things like that. And I think that is kind of, there's almost like a cynicism between just the way movies are kind of pumped out nowadays, and then also kind of with the whole reality piece, and like you said, like trying to get influencers and followers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, Tom and I kind of had that whole conversation about, so Tom kind of took the auditions and managed that casting process for the two leads. Because I make a lot of action-based stuff, my network tends to be sort of, middle-aged bald guys that know how to play bad guys really well. But unfortunately, I don't know too many up-and-coming actresses. So Tom kind of took the burden of going out and casting those two roles. But we did kind of have the whole conversation of, who's best for the film, from an acting perspective, and, who's got a bit of clout on social media, to help promote the film. But, we didn't want to go the cynical route. And I think, at this point, we are kind of, both Tom and I have obviously made things separately, and then, we've got our endeavours together as well. But at this point, we're kind of looking at trying to get, a couple of names in for a day here or there, just to boost the profile of the film, to give it better distribution chances and to add a bit of gravitas to the proceedings, because I think that no matter who it is, if you've got a name in there, it just kind of looks better. People kind of look upon the film in a bit of a better light. But I mean, a lot of the time you see in direct to video movies, and Tom's mentioned this to me several times, is that they'll get people in purely for the sake of it. So they'll get someone like Eric Roberts in and then give him a really terrible part. They don't even get Eric Roberts in and write an Eric Roberts role for him. They totally underuse him, because the guys obviously can chew the scenery like nobody's business, but they then just go, oh, let's just get this guy in for a day, on X amount of money, and that will bump up sales. But you think at the very least give them an interesting part or role to play, and utilize them for what talent they've got and what they're known for. So I mean, that's obviously when we are kind of looking to do that in the future, we'll try to be get people on board based on the merits of the role, and not just, oh, you're a name, do you fancy coming on board this, so we can milk that for all it's worth.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think maybe too, like you probably can attract more like sort of up and coming actors to the piece too, because they might want to be on set with that name for a scene or two, so it probably also helps in terms of casting the other roles.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you kind of call in so many favors, and people kind of expect you to go somewhere, and we are obviously anticipating kind of moving on to bigger and better things as the years go by. But I think that's that is something that will attract other people to the project as well, and give it a bit of weight. But it is an uphill slog. But you got to be in the race to win it, I suppose.
Yeah, one of the things I did talk with Tom about with the movie Renegades that he did with Shogun Films was that they were like, oh, we've got Danny Trejo, or we've got Michael Pare, and he wrote scenes specifically for them that actually made their inclusion in the film much more organic, and it seemed like the actors themselves had more fun with it. So it's like you said, like, if you could just throw Eric Roberts in the film, and it's going to maybe not look, it may not work, but it's just like the idea of, oh, well, we've got Eric Roberts. But if, like you said, if you write scenes specifically for them, I think the actors appreciate it as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one. I mean, I'm currently trying to get a couple of names on board for another film, and that's one of the things that I've been going to agents with. You say, "Oh, I seen them in this film. I thought they were really great. I think they'd really fit this role, and I specifically wrote it with them in mind." You're not just saying kind of what's your price because we could get such and such in for a day to do this. I mean, you got to put a bit of effort into crafting those roles for people to at least make it appealing, especially if you're asking them to do an independent film for not as much money as they'd get for a bigger production. But I watched Renegades recently, and you've got people like Louis Mandylor and Paul Barber. There's a few standouts in there that quite clearly appreciate the kind of film that they're in, but they give it their all, and that sort of pulls a film right up. It's nothing worse than when people phone it in, and when they're actually given something to do. It just makes the performances much better, and it just makes the film gel a lot more.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because you think about When Darkness Falls, I mean, Michaela Longden's performance was really good, but it's you're kind of expecting, right, that if you give her something, she's sort of sort of excited to have the opportunity, right, to really be able to stretch and do something. Whereas, an established name, right, if they don't see that the quality's there, they might just be like, okay, it's just a paycheck, and they'll just kind of do their thing. Whereas if they feel like it, like you said, that they're given something that they can really work with, they're kind of excited too. Because again, they're professionals too. So it's and they obviously really enjoy acting. And so when they get an opportunity to really to do something, even if it's a small part, like you said, they appreciate it. And like you said, it can elevate sort of what the film is, as opposed to somebody just feeling like they've gotten a bait and switch, or the name was just on the tin to draw them in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually, because actors do appreciate when you give them a bit of range and stuff to do, and obviously in horror movies they kind of have to go through quite a range of emotions. Nate was quite a nonchalant character, so I was okay playing him because that's generally what I'm like. But I think the girls definitely had a bigger challenge acting wise. But yeah, Michaela was great, and she gave me a lot of acting tips as well. She's very insightful and knowledgeable, and kind of got me thinking about it in different ways. But actually, Michaela and Elle are totally different to the characters that they play in When Darkness Falls. They're almost opposite. I know that they won't mind me saying this, but Michaela's a little bit on the wild side, very cheeky, very confident, and Elle's quite kind of, I don't want to say shy and retiring, but she's very sweet and sort of got a little bit of a sense of naivety there in a way. So they played totally against what they're like. But in the film that Tom and I are putting together just now, The Baby in the Basket, we've actually kind of flipped it around so that they're kind of playing opposites again. So Michaela's character in The Baby in the Basket is this sort of wayward, potty-mouthed, drunken nun, and Elle's this really kind of devoted, doesn't misbehave character. So yeah, I'm actually looking forward to seeing them completely flip that around and play totally different roles. And I think actually when they read the script, I think both of them appreciated that we're asking them to come in and play totally different characters, and it wasn't just a rerun of When Darkness Falls.
Yeah, I think that was something that we sort of wanted to do right from the off, really, with those two, is kind of flip it around. So yeah, we were thinking that because we wanted to get them both in again, so that was the first thing. And then we thought, we're going to have to switch around their characters so they're not doing the same thing.
Yeah, so it won't feel like a sequel, right? Like it won't feel like another version of When Darkness Falls. Yeah, and maybe this is a good time for us to transition to that project. I think before we do that, I think When Darkness Falls right now, you can catch it on here in the States on Tubi, Peacock, Roku channel. I think it's really worth checking out. Just to kind of give a quick synopsis, Michaela Longden and Emma O'Hara, they play Elle O'Hara, they play two women who are backpacking. They're Americans. They're playing Americans in the film who are backpacking through the Highlands, where they, encounter Nathan's character Nate, and then another character Tommy, who are sort of kind of going through the Highlands, like robbing houses, but also drugging women and raping them. And again, Michaela's character is a little bit more conservative, a little bit less kind of more type A, and so she kind of wants to do this hike, whereas Emma's Andrea character is like the one that's a little bit more like, let's take chances. And the other thing too is that it's interesting because you talk about the naivete in it. There was some naivete just in her interactions with your character, Nathan, because it was like she almost felt like she was in control the whole time, and that interchange between those, when we kind of can see that from a different way.
Yeah, that is true, and I think that probably, I don't want to say that Andrea is a stereotype, but people get a drink in them, they get a bit carried away, they let their guard down, kind of thing. So I think that was kind of a bit of a commentary on that as well. But yeah, the audience are they're kind of one step ahead of the game when the film starts off, but as it progresses and Michaela's character's out searching for Andrea, I think the audience kind of fall behind a bit and things are unfolding with them, and that's been a lot of the feedback has been that people stuck with it and appreciated the slow burn, and but they really liked the payoff at the end, because one of the things that a lot of people have been saying, that the sort of twists and turns, the multiple twists and turns at the end kind of kept them engrossed in it. So yeah, I'm glad that we did that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too about the twists and turns, kind of before we move on to the new project, is they were organic. Right? I think there's enough that's established earlier in the film that you may not necessarily know that it's establishing anything, but as the film goes on, when these twists and turns happen, I think a lot of times when I watch movies that want to try to throw twists and turns, and it's almost like this I always joke that I've got to put on my eye protection because the loose ends are flying together, and I've got to sort of like be careful for it. Whereas this was all organic, like everything that sort of happens in the film, it worked. And I think that's an important piece too, that from a storytelling standpoint and writing standpoint, you can really take the audience wherever you want if it feels organic and it feels like it's working.
Yeah, and one of the things that Tom was pretty good at was, and it was interesting to play around with this in the edit actually, was the breadcrumbs that are left, right from the start in the script. And actually, it might have been maybe a little bit too on the nose. I don't want to say smug, but we kind of took some of the lines, the lines that were really, really obvious, but wouldn't become obvious until after the twist from earlier on in the film, and had them kind of echo in the background in the sound mix as as Jess is searching for Andrea and things are unfolding. But I wasn't too sure if that was too on the nose, but I wanted to bring a bit of appreciation, or people to go, so there was kind of little breadcrumbs left throughout the film kind of as to where it was going to go. And I think the next project is a bit like that in a way too, more on a kind of character basis and sort of foreshadowing or foretelling, because this really is more straight up horror than When Darkness Falls, which I suppose you could say falls into a number of genres, probably mystery thriller with a bit of horror in there. But the next thing, we're kind of going more firmly in the horror genre.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, so before we move on to that, was there anything else that you wanted to mention about When Darkness Falls?
I guess
I believe it's on YouTube now as well, isn't it? On is it Movie Central?
Yeah, it's on Movie Central, so it's getting quite good reception. I think they've had something like over 320,000 views in a few weeks, so people are watching it. But yeah, the film's out there. I mean, you can go to justwatch.com and see what your platform of preference is. But yeah, if you like thrillers, if you like slow burn thrillers with a bit of a payoff at the end, then go check out When Darkness Falls.
Yeah, I think here in the States, because so on IMDb they're listing it as being on the Peacock channel, which is the one that's associated with one of the major cable companies, Comcast, and then the Roku channel, and then of Tubi, of course, is available. And I think, yeah, this is definitely a great, like, especially like looking for something to watch on a Saturday night. This is definitely it's worth it. It's worth checking out on a Saturday. You got you and your significant other, or you're looking for something to watch there. It's definitely, I found it to be a really entertaining film.
Yeah, cheers. I appreciate that.
Now, as we're moving on, so the new film that you're both working on is Baby in the Basket, and we're going to be talking about you're doing a crowdfunding for that.
Yeah, that's right. Tom and I were kind of aware that we wanted to do something else together. And actually, sometimes we'll pitch for what they call reverse engineering, where a distributor actually, instead of acquiring a film that suits their market or their catalog, they will literally just spend the money they would have spent on that acquisition, getting a production company to make one. And actually, Baby in the Basket was something that we had pitched to a couple of companies, and then I think Tom and I kind of both fell in love with the idea to the point where we were like, oh, okay, let's do this ourselves, because with reverse engineering, you have to adhere to, the distributors, guidelines or wants to a certain extent. And, Tom's got experience of this. Sometimes they kind of rip out some of the joy or the slightly more creative elements of it in favor of a more pedestrian approach. So I think Tom and I were of the opinion that we had such a strong vision for this, and one that would, take it off and try and make it ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So especially in Tom's case, I know he writes scripts that the movies are they're shot in England. They're using British actors, but because there's a fear that Americans won't watch something, which I don't quite get, because BBC America is very popular. There are a lot of shows like Doctor Who that are very popular here, but there's an idea, right, that like you can't make it too English for American audiences, that we won't watch it. Which again, When Darkness Falls, I think is a great example of one that people, Americans, I think would really appreciate and really like, even if it is set outside the U.S. But I can see that how like you want to make a movie a certain way, and the distributors say, well, no, Americans won't like it if you don't do X, Y, and Z with it.
Yeah, well, it's a strange one actually, because actually the reason that we the two leads in When Darkness Falls were American is because it was set in Scotland, so we didn't really want to do two British people hiking in Scotland. We wanted to kind of keep that original idea, which was sort of transatlantic fish out of water type thing, because obviously the original 70s one was two British girls in rural France. So. But it was also for that additional appeal to the US audiences. But it's weird because shows like Outlander that are shot here, they're actually more popular in the States than they are here. Some of them.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, like I don't think When Darkness Falls works if they were English, or they're in Scotland, because there are a lot of cultural nuances there that an American wouldn't pick up on. And it, like you said, there's more of a fish out of water element there with that. And so, yeah, I definitely agree with that. But it's weird. Like, I know like Avengement was one that was, really popular. It was really like, an action film that was very, very English. And I do know that there were some Americans who looked at that and were like, well, I don't understand what the characters are saying, or I don't understand what's happening. Whereas, for most of us action fans, we were like, no, this is how a movie should be made. Like, this is, plenty good enough for us. This is, we don't really need it. I don't think it would have worked if they had said like, well, no, Scott Adkins' character is based in America and it's an American crime, syndicate or whatever. It wouldn't have worked the way it did by having it shot in England.
I think certainly the London accent, or even kind of as far up as Manchester, translates a bit better, across the pond. I know that, something like Avengement, you've got London accents and whatnot, and I think that Americans are used to hearing those. When it comes to Scottish, probably not anywhere near as much. Some of our accents are. My accent is sometimes so broad that my own boss from down in London can't understand what I'm saying, and we're from the same country. But I remember my American friend. She is from Mississippi, so she's got that sort of really drawn out Southern drawl, and she watches Trainspotting with the subtitles on.
It's funny. Like, so part of it was with America is that the English that we've been sold for so long is the kind of the BBC Oxford English. That seems to be like the one that's projected. Like, even like the big action star from England, James Bond, or the main action character, he speaks with that very refined Oxford English. And it's funny because I think that's what's projected to the world. Like, if you ask people who are learning English what the difference is between American English and the Queen's English or UK English, they would say, well, American English has more slang in it, as if like people in England never use slang terms, right? That like, but that's the idea, because that's kind of what's projected. And I think then when a movie, like I think my wife, for example, was talking about, we were watching the original Office, with Ricky Gervais, and it was kind of the same thing where she was like, I'm having trouble understanding what they're saying, because he was speaking faster and everything. And I think that is part of it, is that Americans have had this idea of what how people in the UK speak, and it's always that kind of that BBC Oxford English. And I think if we're exposed to it more, though, I think they people would be able to hear it and pick up on it more.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. And actually, if you look at any of the earlier Guy Ritchie movies, especially down in London, slang is a huge thing. In fact, it's almost kind of got its own, subculture or sub language. So is different areas of Scotland. I mean, I reckon probably if Tom was walking down the street in Glasgow on a Saturday night at midnight, he would be thinking, "What are these people saying?" But I think you've got that same element of slang down in London and whatnot. But yeah, I think you're right. It's probably the sort of Downton Abbey the American audiences have been accustomed to.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, it colors, for people that are coming from England who go to America, it actually kind of, in terms of them being competitive in the job market and things like that, like they automatically have a leg up because they can kind of just go in and turn it on, and Americans are going to think that they're more sophisticated and smarter and all of those kinds of things. So it does have like a bit of a competitive edge there too. But what it does mean is like, yeah, something like Avengement, not everybody's going to look at it and say like, okay, this is something that I want to watch because like you said, it's not Downton Abbey or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Again, that film is so appealing because Scott Adkins is, he's not playing the kind of straight action hero guy. He's playing someone that's pretty crazy and is essentially a bad guy. But that's why the film, again, it's why it works, is because it's got an interesting lead in it.
Yeah, and it is like very kind of almost like Tom, were you gonna say something?
No, I was just going to say it's just a bit of an irony that Scott Adkins is so popular, kind of in America, at the DTV level anyway, but he really struggles to find an audience in the UK, which was particularly surprising on something like Avengement, which really kind of probably fits more into what UK audiences have found quite enjoyable to watch, because it's got those elements of like a Guy Ritchie film within it. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame really that he hasn't really got a bigger UK audience.
Yeah, I mean, Scott Adkins is massively underrated to me, or he's not kind of been given some of the chances that he should have been. If you push the martial arts skills to the side for a second, I was watching a clip from John Wick 4. I'm thinking they've given him a totally different look, but I mean, the guy is actually a really good actor when he's kind of let off the leash and given these parts like an Avengement or even, Boyka from the Undisputed movies, or he makes a great bad guy, but the more sort of lunatic his good guy character is as well, the better he comes off. I think in a lot of direct-to-video writing, you got this really pedestrian, bog standard hero that's not very interesting. But then when he's given something to do like Avengement, I think that he shines. And it is a shame that he's not been given, parts and bigger parts in bigger movies. He's just always the guy that kicks, which is a shame.
Yeah, it's like Michael J. White once said, if you get known for kicking people in the head, like, or if you kick people in the head, you get known for kicking people in the head, meaning like, yeah, like those are the only parts you get. And I wonder too, with him not getting the kind of success in England, if part of that's like, it seems like only the films he does with Jesse V. Johnson allow him to use his English accent. That like, it seems like a lot of times he plays Americans or Russians, especially when he works with Isaac Florentine. And I wonder if that's part of it too, is that he never gets a chance to play a Brit in his films. It's like only Jesse V. Johnson lets him do that.
Yeah, and I think that he's actually usually better in those parts. It comes off as more natural. I mean, I guess if you're putting on an accent, I mean, I'm typical male, can't multitask, but I find it hard enough to act without putting on an accent as well. So I feel that some of his most natural performances are when he's using his own accent. And like we were just talking about, his accent is probably a lot more. His own accent is probably a lot more palatable to international audiences than mine is, for example.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Tom.
But I think it's because I think that for American audiences, it's funny. I don't know where the mindset comes from distributors with that idea that Americans need to see Americans in movies, that we can't watch a movie with Scott Adkins with it, being a Brit, and also even the fact that like it seems like with the Isaac Florentine movies, it's almost like he he feels like we won't believe it enough, which, I mean, there's those debt collector movies that he does with Jesse V. Johnson, and nobody really cares how he got to Los Angeles, right? It's not like we're saying like, oh man, yeah, like Scott Adkins, what is this Brit doing in Los Angeles? What, this doesn't make any sense to us. It's like, no, we're perfectly fine with it. And so it's not like we need like so much of an explanation for how he gets there, because everybody seems to make it to Los Angeles somehow anyway.
Well, that's the thing. I've seen a couple of Gerard Butler movies recently that when he's not putting on his accent, they've literally felt the need to explain in the first 5 minutes what he's doing in the States, or or it's like, how did you get here? One of the characters asks him, and you're thinking, is that really relevant? I mean, I suppose it's quite funny in a way, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's an interesting. So I kind of coming back to what you both were talking about, like wanting to kind of make this on your own. I can kind of see that where like distributors kind of take the movies, and I think like from with some of the films that Tom's written that we have here available in the States, where it's like you've written something that you kind of have I mean, obviously probably when you give it to them that they're going to do something different with it, but it's almost like you're writing a film. And the film is made in England. It's acted by British actors, but yet everybody's supposed to be American. And it's like when you see the reviews, people are like, "Well, that's definitely not America." And so it's like not like anybody's being fooled by it. And I don't think Americans would watch it and be like, "Oh, well, I don't want to watch something that takes place in England." It seems like if it says the cover usually can if it's compelling enough, people will watch it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think if you're my predominant audience has always been American anyway, so pretty much everything I've written, the first audience that kind of gets the film is America. And if you've got an American audience, they're going to be the first one that can kind of pick apart where someone's accent maybe isn't quite so good. I mean, I had a film recently called Firenado, and I'd written it as I've been sort of told that, because sometimes I'll ask, oh, where's this set? Who's in it? What the characters like? And I was told, this one's going to be set in England. We can have English characters. And I've got a character in there called Pierce Moore, which is obviously a combination of Pierce Brosnan and Roger Moore. So he's meant to be this quintessential kind of Englishman, kind of suave and sophisticated. But from the point of me handing over the script to the film actually being shot, they've changed the character to being this kind of almost like, I'm not even too sure what the actor was going for, because he I think he did about 10 different accents, kind of spread all across America throughout the film. Ranging from sort of Yosemite Sam to sort of Brooklyn gangsters. And they've had a few rewrites, and this is probably something that's been requested, maybe a week or so before the shoot, where maybe one of the people putting the money in or one of the distributors has kind of said, okay, I think we need some American characters in here. Maybe we need to set this in America. So it kind of gets a bit confused on the screen because, they have to change the script so quickly. And maybe they've not gone, through it with a fine-tooth comb, with continuity and things like that. So, you get confusing statements in the film, like one person will refer to counties instead of states. Yeah. Some characters are putting on an American accent, some aren't. So that was kind of one of the things people picked up in the reviews for that film in particular. But it tends to happen quite a lot in my films, where it's just a confusing state as to where it's set, and what, why there's American characters there. Is it set in America? Is it set in the UK? So just from a continuity perspective, because sometimes this has changed so late on, it doesn't get kind of ironed out before they take it to film, and obviously they can't do much after that in the edit. So yeah, it's just a strange thing. I think sometimes distributors kind of sort of cut off their nose to spite their face in some ways.
Yeah, and I think you can make a point with When Darkness Falls that I think, kind of you both being allowed to just make the movie the way you wanted to make the movie, it works, right? In the sense that and I think even with your character, I think there were a couple. I joked with Tom about this. I think there were a couple things I caught that Americans wouldn't say that Michaela and Andre said. I can't remember what they were. There are a couple small ones, but it's like with the whole movie really working, you don't really think about it, right? It's not like it's sort of like I kind of get what you were going for in the film, and so a couple of those things, it's just sort of as American, you sort of just catch it because it's not natural, but when it's done sort of like you said, sort of haphazardly, last minute, that kind of thing, then it's not forgiven as much. And I do think from a distributor standpoint, I think obviously they don't care enough about sort of the people involved with making the film and all that. But I think that's where I think sometimes from reviewers' standpoints, where you start to get those reviews where people kind of trash the whole movie, right? Or you get those IMDb reviews where the whole thing is bad, where there's a kind of an earnestness from the people making the film, right? I mean, you still got a crew that is professional and trying to put together a solid film, and you've got actors that are trying to give the best performances they can. And like in your case, you wrote a script that you wanted to work and everything was there. And then when they start playing around with it and things don't work, it's almost like people just say the whole movie's bad. And it's sort of like everybody's involved who's professional and has a sense of pride in it. They go on IMDb and see people giving it a bad review or whatever. I can kind of see where it's like with this movie that you're talking about, Baby in the Basket, where you're like, we don't want to see that happen to this film.
Yeah, it's weird, and it's almost totally polarized even between the platforms. Like reviewers on IMDb are absolutely ruthless. They will slate the film, every single aspect of it. They won't sort of think that everything is this $200 million Hollywood production. They won't appreciate usually the intent or the effort behind it. But then weirdly, when I went on to Movie Central on YouTube to have a look at what people were saying about When Darkness Falls, majority of the comments were really positive or really encouraging. So yeah, it's weird. And I think that's the thing, you kind of have to come out with something better each time, or try and make your next thing better than the last. You always want to progress, but I think that certainly for me, I don't know about Tom, but I guess the recognition even by sort of film critics, from indie sites or just any film critics, that is to me a step up, if you're getting people saying good things about the film. And I think that it's always nice when critics appreciate the budget level and what you've got to work with, and acknowledge that and base that around, base the review around that. They're not comparing it to some $200 million production. I remember reading one critic review for Shrek the Third, I think it was, and the movie reviewer, I don't know who it was, said the film was too childish. I'm thinking, sorry, a kid's movie was too childish. Next you're going to be complaining that a comedy's too funny. It's like, what does that even mean?
It sounds like something my daughter would say. I mean, she said to me the other day she didn't want to wear this particular jumper, and her reasoning was, and she had a bit of a meltdown about this. Her reasoning was it was too cute. So,
wasn't one of yours, was it, Tom?
It was actually, yeah.
Oh, right.
My unicorn jumper, yeah.
Well, I always kind of tell the story about Albert Pyun, the director, because when I first started my site, I was like kind of wanting to be snarky and kind of joke about the kind of direct-to-video action movies that we were watching, that I was watching, and kind of my friends and I kind of thinking about us kind of joking about the film. And I was reviewing Mean Guns, and I like some of the film effects that he was using in there. They didn't work for me, and so I said it was like directed by because I didn't know who Albert Pyun was, directed by someone who did car commercials, here in the States. And, he easily could have, commented and said, or just not even talked to me ever again. But actually, I watched another one of his films, and I was like, it was really bad. And I kind of gave him the benefit of the doubt for it being really bad. I said, this doesn't really look good. And Albert Pyun as a director is better than this. So something must have gone wrong with this film. And he said, well, yeah. I guess a creative film was lost in transit from Eastern Europe to America, and they had to kind of piece together as best as we could. But he actually could have just like kind of just ignored me after the first one. And it wasn't until later, I had a kind of a relationship with him talking about his films that he came back to me and said, "Can you review Mean Guns again? And can you just give it another chance? Because I really like Mean Guns, and I think you might like it if you give it another chance." And I went back and read my review and saw what I'd said about him. And that was kind of a lesson for me that, like, okay, yes, it's fun to be snarky about these movies. And I think with some of these low budget actioners, PM Entertainment films like that, you can joke about how many cars are flipped in the film. And in those, there are ways to have fun with the movie. But I think, kind of, there's a point where the snark has to end, or where, like you've got to, I kind of learned, that there's still, I think for me, it was like a lesson that, like, okay, there are human beings behind the movies. They're making the movies, and they're sort of earnestly trying to put something together, and that there are so many other factors involved that can make a movie work or not work, that it's a matter of sort of like, okay, if the movie doesn't work for me, I need to be more direct about what about it doesn't work for me, and not say that the director sounds like a car commercial director, and even a car commercial director is still directing something, but more like, okay, I didn't like the effects of, like, the sped up film in Mean Guns or whatever it was. There was a certain part of it that just didn't hit well for me, and that I get why other people like the film. And it was kind of a lesson for me in sort of how to approach those, because you're right, like, people, I think you look at like IMDb reviews of movies, and it's kind of like, like, what is the purpose of this person coming on here just saying how much they don't like the film?
Yeah, and it's a little bit like, someone once said to me about a job interview that they'd gone onto this website called Glassdoor and said they'd read some really bad things about the company. And I said, yeah, but if people have had a bad experience, they're more compelled to write about it, whether that be TripAdvisor or a film or a place that they've worked. I was like, actually, less people will go on and say, actually, I had a great time working here, or I had a great stay, or this was a great movie. I think that people are more compelled, if they've not enjoyed something, to go online and complain about it. So, God forbid I ever set up that escort service.
Well, I think what I noticed, they had this issue with Renegades, and basically they had a kind of slurry of negative ratings and reviews, but this came, within hours of it leaking online from pirates. So a lot of the time, you get these kind of, I don't know, like 3 or 4 line reviews just completely slating the film without anything constructive. And then, a lot of the times it's from people who have pirated the film. So, I mean, they've not even paid to watch it, which is like, it makes it even worse, I think.
Yeah, because I think that's right. I think I saw one on Twitter who did that, where Jonathan caught that they were from the UK and the film hadn't been released in the UK yet.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, it's just one of those things that it's kind of like a modern thing now, and you kind of have to deal with it. I think it's interesting that, I think me and Nathan have both noticed this, but there's been a little bit of a switch around, whereas YouTube comments used to be really kind of, consistently negative. And then you'd go to IMDb and you'd see something a bit more rounded, maybe. I think it's flipped on its head now.
Yeah.
So I tend to get a more kind of, reasonable comments about some of my films on YouTube over IMDb.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed too with IMDb is I think sometimes the people who are involved with making the movie, and some of the independent ones, they might write the review, or they, or like I think sometimes the IMDb person who watches the movie really doesn't like it. They almost feel like they've been done an injustice by the people who gave it a good review, and they feel like they need to, like, and it's kind of funny because, like, I think to Nathan's point earlier about the video on demand audience, really all that they've lost was time, right? In most cases, either you've subscribed to the service, so you're getting as many films as you want for the subscription fee, or in a case like a movie like, a company like Tubi, or the Roku channel, you're just logging in and watching the film. And so it's not even like that there was any kind of financial cost involved that causes people to be so angry about the movie.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think we're in that kind of that kind of weird stage where people do get angry that they spent 15, 20 minutes watching something that they didn't ultimately enjoy. But I mean, Tom and I have talked about this as well. Fair enough, back in the day, if you went to Blockbuster or wherever and rented a VHS, you had paid for that, so you were going to sit and watch it start to finish. Then if you want to write a bad review, you've probably got justification to do that. But I think when people don't even sit the entire film out on digital, or that's the thing, you've got this sort of tapestry of blockbuster movies that cost a fortune to make, and then you've got the latest kind of indie film that's doing quite well that's sitting right next to it. But you can't compare those two titles.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the case. I think, again, looking at When Darkness Falls, I think, I think there are areas where I think a movie like When Darkness Falls actually is filling a space in the industry that this push to blockbusters has left open. It's like, it seems like all of these movies are like 3 hours long and they're just so like big and over the top. And I think there is a space for a movie like a When Darkness Falls, but it's like the theater doesn't want anything to do with a movie like that nowadays. And then for people looking for it, right, it's hard to even know where to go to find, because it's like when you're on Tubi, for example, you see tons of thrillers. They're just kind of all stacked up there online, and then it's like, which one do I start? Which one do I watch? And I think that's the other part of it, is sort of like, getting the word out. Because I think, again, with When Darkness Falls, I think that's something that people would really enjoy. And, sort of knowing like, okay, is this When Darkness Falls, is this the good one versus this one here that, where a teacher and their student are having an affair, and is that the and then the student starts stalking the teacher? Is that the one, it's like, people don't know which one to pick out of those. And I think that's the other problem too. There's so many options now that, it's easy for things to get lost. But then also, people, they feel like they're almost like playing roulette. And when they make the choice, if it doesn't fulfill it, it's almost like they take it personally.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge volume of content out there. I mean, digital filmmaking, you can go pick up a camera for, you can go pick up a 4K camera for next to nothing these days. So it's not like back in the past where you had to have some serious money to buy that film stock. Everyone and their grands out there making a film. And the problem is you've got so many streaming platforms and you've got this huge wealth of content, and it's almost impossible to stand out. I mean, you can't, go and advertise your movie on Tubi and, pay to get it, to get ads on there or anything like that. But the indies have obviously, they kind of start with a bit of a handicap because, people know about the new Mission Impossible movie. They'll go search for it on Amazon. It'll pop up in the most watched. When Darkness Falls is never going to pop up in the most watched. Although actually it was up the top in Vudu when it came out. So maybe that's nonsense, but it's difficult to get there. And, for every When Darkness Falls that maybe does get towards the top of the most watched, you'll get another 100 movies like it that are, that don't do well. And that's what makes it so difficult to try and, generate cash flow as well, because with so many movies not making their money back or being unsuccessful, and if they're good, it means that indie filmmakers can't, go and make the next one. And sometimes there's no rhyme or reason as to, why something takes off or catches on and, why something doesn't. And I'm not too sure what the answer is in terms of, giving yourself that airtime and how to do it. I mean, this is something that Tom and I were talking about as well. If you go into a DVD store, for example, the direct-to-video movie of the week will be next to Mission Impossible on the shelf, but it's never going to be there on digital. Amazon's not going to suddenly recommend you, this little tiny movie called When Darkness Falls after someone's watched the latest Mission Impossible. So it's difficult, and I'm not too sure what. I don't know if this is kind of going to come full circle or how the industry is going to develop. It's going to be interesting to see with the volume of content and, with that huge range where, back in the past you would have, everything would kind of cost $1 million plus, even low budget would be kind of classed as 5 million. These days that could be 5,000 that someone's made a film for. And I think as well, in terms of, you're talking about, people watching blockbusters, I think there's a little bit more of a shift now to people seeking out some more unique content. I think that people might be starting to tire of the overblown, 250 million CGI epics, and they're looking for something more real and grassroots. And certainly, I mean, I'm probably not the best person to comment because, I'm a filmmaker, but I tend to find myself searching for more obscure or independent thrillers that, you read the synopsis and you think, oh, that sounds quite interesting, as opposed to just sticking on, the latest Marvel or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I think, like to the video store concept, I mean, the Asylum, film distribution company, I mean, that's how they got their start, right? Was that they would put, their version of War of the Worlds on it would be on the Blockbuster shelf right next to the Tom Cruise War of the Worlds, and then people would rent it, or, I'm going to put, they'll put Transmorphers next to Transformers, and that's when people would do that. Where, like you said, nowadays, that option isn't there because it's like sort of like, how the streaming site, and then it's like a matter of like people's algorithms, right? Like I think if you watch a couple When Darkness Falls, then you start getting recommended more of those. But if you're watching, like you said, you're watching the Marvel movie, or like you said, even like Mission Impossible or something, it's not going to recommend When Darkness Falls. That's the other piece of it too, right? Is that everything's sort of dictated by these algorithms where these streaming sites want to predict what they think your next movie should be.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the moment as well, I think a lot of indie filmmakers, they kind of overlook this fact. And there's a guy called Jay Horton who does all these great kind of distribution and advice and things. But one thing that people always tend to overlook from the filmmaker's perspective is how much you have to do yourself in terms of marketing your film and trying to spread the word. Because a lot of filmmakers, if they get a distribution deal, for example, they will just expect the distributor to do it all. So, you've got to take on a lot of the work yourself, particularly now that there's so many more kind of self-distribution avenues as well. So, you've almost got to be ready to market your film and, try and pluck some audience from somewhere yourself.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I do get it from a distributor's point of view. They're never going to spend $100,000 marketing a film that cost, $20,000 and that might not recoup that cost. But I think they're probably, and Jay Horton's highlighted this, but there is a naivety in filmmakers. And, I can see their point. If you get a film to a distributor, you would think that it would be in their best interest to do some marketing on the film as well. But a lot of the time at this level, they genuinely don't. They are sort of the onus on them stops when they put the film out there, and that's it. I mean, someone said, some companies literally just acquire volume. They throw that much at the wall and hope something sticks, but they don't bother doing any bespoke marketing for any of the films that they put out. So that is left up to the producer, who's already put the time in making the film and delivering it to the distributor. I mean, I kind of see it as a two-way street. To me, the distributor should be doing some marketing and utilizing the producer to help do that. It should be a 50-50 split, especially if they're on a rev share. If no money's exchanged hands, to me, the distributor at the very least should be offering the chance to actually market the film and get it out there to help the producer if they've not paid anything up front for it. But a lot of the time that's not the case. So you're trying to kind of shout above the crowd in a way, and all these other people that have had their indie movies released on that particular day or week.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned too is almost like this sort of democratization of filmmaking, right? Where sort of anybody can go out and get a camera and make a film. And I think that's probably one of the other things that people kind of fear, right, when they're on Tubi is like, okay, what kind of quality is this movie? And I think like one of the things I was talking with Tom about with When Darkness Falls was the use of drone shots. And it's almost like this in vogue thing, right, where so many filmmakers just use as many drone shots as they can. But in When Darkness Falls, they served a purpose, right? They actually enhance the film, like again that juxtaposition of the wide open spaces that become claustrophobic when it's dark out. We wouldn't have gotten any of that without the drone shots. And so it's like that idea that like, yeah, I think it's like that, you have to trust, right, that the filmmakers are competent in making a good film, that they're not just going to kind of just use whatever like gimmicks they can, or they kind of know what they're doing. But I think that's one of the other problems, right, is that it is a matter of like sort of like you said, having to try to get the word out somehow that like, no, I'm a competent filmmaker. Like I made a solid film that I think you're going to enjoy here, and that it's not going to be something where it's just like I just put something together.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing. Back in the day, you would have literally have had to go in a helicopter to go and get those shots, or got stock shots and tried to make them fit. But again, you can get a 4K drone for next to nothing and send it up there and get those fantastic shots. I think you're right; they're probably a little bit overused in some productions, and I'm sure that we cut a few because we did want to show the expanse, and we got so much great drone footage that it seemed a shame to chop it all. But that's just the bane of editing. Some of the stuff you have to lose whether you want to or not. But that's something that I kind of been discussing with our DOP for The Baby in the Basket, because the film is set in the 1940s. We're not going to do any drone stuff or any stuff like that would replicate helicopter shots, because we feel that would not be authentic to that time period.
That's interesting. So this movie that you're doing now, Baby in the Basket, that's something, it takes place. It's a period film that takes place in the 40s, so it's not a modern setting.
No, and this is something that Tom and I had discussed. I think we decided that fairly early on, but the setting and whatnot really, would inform a period piece. It would make total sense to set it back in the 40s. So we had various different discussions, because obviously setting a film back in the past comes with its own challenges, but due to the remoteness of the location and the plot itself, we decided that would be easier than doing 1920s New York like The Great Gatsby or something like that. So it is still going to be a challenge to pull off. We're shooting the teaser, and Andy, the DOP, said he's like, you've got a light up fire exit sign in the shot. He's like, that definitely would not have been around in the 1940s. And I was like, yep, we need to crop that out. So I think that's something that we're going to kind of come up against. But, in trying to make the film look like it's from the 1940s, I think we're probably going to employ some of the same techniques, or actually make it look as if it was shot in the 1940s. We won't have drone shots, we won't have any shots using a gimbal. We'll try and use a track, and all the kind of old-fashioned equipment, and then right down to the score. I had a chat with a guy who's going to be creating the score, who's got some samples of some instruments that were actually from the 1940s. So we're going to try our best to bring a real sense of authenticity to it, but it's going to be a challenge, because it's not something that I don't think Tom or I have done before. I certainly haven't.
No, I've not. I don't think I've ever done anything. Not a period piece like that. No.
Now, when it comes to things like costumes and things like that, is that something that's sort of like you're able to like maybe go to a company that has those costumes, or do you have to try to go out and find things that would fit for that period?
Well, I think instead of kind of, I suppose, talking around it and suggesting, I think the fact that the setting, which is this monastery, it's very specific. It's not like again, you're setting it in a city or something like that. So I don't know if you want to kind of explain a bit about the plot, Tom, and how that kind of informed the period piece in that decision.
Yeah. So basically, the plot sees this remote monastery, kind of set. We haven't necessarily stated firmly exactly where it's set, but it's kind of like off an island off the Shetlands, sort of northern Scotland, and we kind of wanted to make it a period setting, but we kind of discussed a few different eras at times, but then we finally settled on setting it kind of at the tail end of the Second World War, because we felt that having the setting there, and particularly with one of the characters, character that Nathan's actually playing, being a soldier who'd been sent back from the war, so he's kind of got a little bit of sort of PTSD within the film, and that kind of affects his character. So you've got this remote convent and a small group of nuns, and there's a storm coming in. And then, obviously, where the title comes in, someone leaves a baby in a basket on their doorstep, just as this storm is kind of arriving. Once the baby's taken inside, one of the nuns, played by Amber Doig-Thorne, she's just been in that Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey. So she's kind of, having a bit of a nice moment in the limelight at the moment. So she's kind of like the most young, most kind of I guess, naive of the characters, really sort of devoted to God. And then she gets this kind of sense that this baby might be ungodly or might be possessed by the devil. So, she starts getting driven a little bit mad by the presence of the baby. They kind of shut her away for a bit, and then progressively these sort of strange things start occurring within the convent. And so it's going to kind of be this very kind of dark gothic horror, dealing with a few kind of religious themes as well.
Yeah, and that makes sense, I guess, from a costume standpoint, right? That if you've got, sort of let's say like clerical outfits, right? That makes it a little bit easier to do that part. But I think, yeah, it does sound like, from kind of sort of juxtaposing it with When Darkness Falls, that it does feel like this is one that might sort of jump out a little. I mean, like I can see maybe a potential slow burn, but it does seem like it could be also something, like you said, it's more of a straight ahead kind of horror film.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of something that Tom and I discuss as well, because I know Tom's a fan of the kind of slow burn horror movies as well. I mean, one of my favorite horror movies is Rosemary's Baby, and that really builds up. It's a bit of a masterclass in tension, I would say. I remember watching it myself and kind of being on the edge of my seat. And I don't really scare very easily. I don't watch too many things where I'm like, oh, this is terrifying. But I think it was just that sort of sense of hopelessness that Rosemary had, that nobody believed her. And, that kind of instills a bit of panic in the viewer. But I think we're hoping to kind of use some of that initial tension. It almost kind of starts off as a bit of a melodrama in a way, because Black Narcissus is probably another, certainly in terms of visual and in terms of tone, is probably another inspiration. But yeah, I think it's probably going to be another kind of When Darkness Falls, in terms of it starts off as a slow burn and then gets pretty crazy towards the end. I mean, that obviously kind of, I think, worked for us before, but certainly this has got much more of a horror slant, probably, much more atmospheric, and you're setting it within. I always think that these the churches and whatnot make for really kind of great settings for horror movies. They do have that kind of gothic edge and look to them, as opposed to just setting it in a suburban house or something like that. There's a real sense of atmosphere in these types of locations. So, but I think certainly if you want to compare it to When Darkness Falls, this probably gets a bit more supernatural towards the end, certainly, even although part of it's psychological, because what we're kind of playing on, certainly with the audience, is, are the nuns, have they been driven mad by the isolation and the storm, or is there really weight in, Agnes's theory that the baby is actually the son of the devil? And that's something that we're going to play with right up until the end and be a bit ambiguous with that.
Yeah, and like when you talk about the setting, I mean, that just, one of the things I think of is, the old, like, sort of Hammer horror films where they would use these great religious settings for things. I mean, obviously they can get a little bit hokey with, like, the werewolves and the vampires and things like that would happen in the films. But the settings themselves were always really nice. And like you said, there's a sort of an isolation to them that, like, they were these, and a lot of times the films would create an isolated aspect. Like, I think of, I can't remember the name of it. There was a vampire one where, like, a couple is, like, traveling in Bavaria and they get stranded because of a rock slide or something like that forces them to be stuck. And they want to use the wife for, like, some sort of like ritual or something like that. But the setting itself has that feel to it, and I think, yeah, like those old English churches, I think, lend themselves to that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I even kind of like, it's not something that you would see these days, but I even like those sort of, they had a sort of texture to them, these older films. I don't know if it was because of the occasionally painted backdrops or the sort of technicolor or the technology that they used at the time. But, if you look at something like Black Narcissus, the colors in it and the depth is really interesting. So, we're going to try and create something a little bit like that. And probably with use of lighting as well. I think we're going to go a little bit film noir on it. So it's a difficult one, because I don't want to jinx it, but I think it's going to be something that's either kind of going to fall apart or that we're going to pull off really well. you know, when you read it on the page and you visualize it in your head, it's just about when you read it on the page and you visualize it in your head, it's just about trying to put that on film.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think it's one of the things that with digital film nowadays, right, is that we do kind of lose a little bit, is that there's almost like I don't want to say washed out aspect to it, but because obviously, right, you want to match all the colors, and it's easier to do with digital if everything's sort of muted some. And I guess also to it, especially in America, commercials tend to be very big with colors, and it's almost like filmmakers don't want to look like they're making commercials. But you're right that like those older films had color, they used color in a way that really could make things like the blood stand out, or the environment or the settings.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is another conversation that Tom and I have had about, various different films looking very kind of grey and washed out. And I think that to me that is a style, but some of the time I would rather go a little bit blue and a little bit desaturated. But things sometimes these days don't even look as if they have been graded. And like you say, the commercials are kind of big bursts of colour, like these older Technicolor movies used to be, the Wizard of Oz and stuff like that. I appreciate that's a kids movie, but it's just an example. But yeah, Tom and I were discussing, you seem to get that sort of loss of any colour in a lot of modern movies, especially at the direct-to-video level, where it looks as if they've almost kind of left it in, the one of the camera settings and not put very much into the grade.
Yeah, there seems to be a lack of contrast sometimes as well. It's almost like it kind of, very kind of faded look to it. Sometimes you're almost wondering if you have to turn the brightness up on your TV. So we kind of wanted to step away from that very, very definitely. So that's where we have, ideas of like having maybe noirish lighting. So we got a bit of contrast in there as well. But yeah, so we really want to make it kind of have a good old-fashioned look, because I think people also appreciate that as well. That kind of those retro looks and nostalgic looks kind of appeal to a lot of audiences these days. I mean, if you look at something like The Lighthouse, for example, with the very old kind of aesthetic.
Yeah, and even the acting is sort of melodramatic in that. I mean, it's not something that it might end up coming across as a bit hokey, but I think that that's something we'll probably try and draw on as well. And certainly from Tom's perspective in writing the script, he had to make it seem like it was the 1940s in terms of dialogue, and would people say that back in the 1940s? So I think in order to kind of bring that sense of the period as well, I think that we'll maybe go slightly melodramatic on the acting, but it's hopefully something that people are going to pick up on what we're trying to do. That's when I was talking about conveying something visually, you've got an idea, but to try and go out and make it look like it was shot in the 1940s and have the acting kind of be from that period in time, it's going to be quite a challenge to do that.
Yeah, and that might be another area too, where having more like clerical characters in the film, right? That they might be less likely to use the slang terms of that time or speak, they wouldn't want to sound vulgar, perhaps. And so that might help in that sense, that their language might be easier to date versus, if you were, like you said, like shooting something in the city in the 40s, it might be a little bit different.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that you probably, I once heard someone say that period pieces are sort of ageless because by their very nature, they're already shot in the past. So I would hope that that's, something that we're going to be able to do with this, is that people do appreciate or understand what we're trying to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think even with When Darkness Falls, that there's almost like an agelessness to that as well, right? Because it's in that remote location. And I mean, obviously there's certain aspects of it that, I mean, you wouldn't have known, like, for example, that it was that you were shooting it during the pandemic, right? That it didn't have a feel of like it was definitely being, shot in 2020, that it could have been in the 2010s, sometime before that as well. I mean, the characters they were dressed in a modern way, but not in a modern way that, like, 10 years from now or something like that, that you'd look at it and say, like, okay, that's definitely not, that's definitely from a certain period of time. But yeah, like you said, like if you make something, it's shot in the 40s, and again, a lot of people in religious attire. I think also like with military attire, it's sometimes a little bit easier to get, something that matches there. That yeah, people are going to watch it. They can watch it 20 years from now, and it'll still take place in the 40s.
Yeah, and that's something that Tom and I looked at, during the writing process for When Darkness Falls, is that we kind of immediately wanted to take out any modern stuff that would kind of, because of mobile phones and stuff like that, it's very easy to say, oh, well, they would just phone the police,
Right.
Because then you kind of get the whole, okay, there's no signal. Do we go down that route? So we tried mostly as much as we could to take kind of modern day and technology out of it as much as possible, so that it would be a bit of a throwback to those kind of 70s thrillers, maybe a little bit of Alfred Hitchcock, but it meant that we weren't having to make constant excuses for technology, because sometimes that's kind of where the plot holes come from, or something that you have to get round. You put characters in a situation and you think, well, wait a minute, they would just go and do X, Y, and Z because they've got the technology to do so. So we tried to remove that a little bit to give us a bit more creative freedom with the plot in When Darkness Falls. And I think certainly with Baby in the Basket, it will do that as well, because you've got them using old-fashioned radios to try and get in touch with the mainland and stuff like that. It lends itself probably more to the horror genre, because you are putting them in this kind of hopeless situation and removing all the modern technology that could potentially aid their, return to safety or whatever.
Yeah, and I think isolation in itself is a really great horror device. I mean, I think just I remember on a previous podcast back in the earlier iteration of this podcast, where I had a co-host, Jamie, who we would just watch a movie and discuss it. And there was a French film about hikers who they take a route. I think they're climbing in like Croatia, and they take a route that's like they shouldn't have been taking, or it was listed as closed, and they end up getting lost, and they're kind of stuck on this mountainside. And I know from my own experience hiking or ice climbing that, like, when you're stuck, when you can't get down from where you are, or you can't find your way out, that it's actually a lot scarier. Or when you're lost, when you're lost in the woods and you can't find your way somewhere, that there's almost a sense of being trapped without necessarily being trapped. And it's like, well, how am I going to, finding your way to freedom there? And I think that's kind of like similar to, when they're people are isolated on an island. If there's a storm or something like that, there's a sense of, being imprisoned, I think, in and of itself can be a scary device. And then when it's done in a natural way, it's even more interesting, because it's not as simple as like being in a cage and having to find your way out of a cage, right? I mean, that's like such a classic device, right? That a character is knocked out and then they wake up in a cage and they've got to figure out why this person has them in a cage and whatever, or something like that. But when it's something that's that nature is having a piece of it, or nature has a part of it, it almost makes it more insidious, because you can't reason or negotiate with nature. Nature is going to do what it's going to do.
Yeah, and I think that sort of the idea of isolation is really fascinating. I mean, that's what makes The Shining so scary as well. The fact that they're in this really nice hotel, but it's out there in the middle of nowhere. And actually, it takes something that's, you would think, oh, that's quite nice. It's like a retreat, and makes it utterly horrific. I don't know if you guys saw the film Fall, where there was these two girls that were trapped up the top of, I guess it was maybe like a TV tower or something like that, out in the middle of nowhere. And that was really interesting, because again, they're up in this kind of huge expanse, but they're on this tiny platform really high up. And I appreciated that concept. I thought that was a really great idea. Execution aside, whatever your opinion of how successfully the film pulled that off, I think that was a great concept, and almost kind of became more of a horror, but there's no real bad guy. There's no supernatural goings on. It literally is just situational horror, where they're in such a mess, and you start to put yourself in that situation and go, what on earth would I do? Because I remember turning to the person that I went to see the film with, and about 15 minutes in, I would have just jumped off there and killed myself by this point, rather than go through the next hour and a half of trauma up this television tower or whatever it was.
Yeah, and you make a great point to bring up The Shining, because Stephen King, he grew up in the state that I grew up in Maine, and it's interesting. I grew up kind of closer to the city of Boston, so it's kind of a little bit more of a suburban vibe. But going to school, I went to the University of Maine, which is like 3 hours north of there. And it's like this thing where you're driving on the highway, or the motorway, that like you get these long stretches where there's no exits and it's just trees. But also too, when you get off the highway, you don't necessarily know what you're getting into. But during the day, it all looks really nice and quaint. These small, quaint towns in Maine, and there's nice trees, and maybe it's near the ocean. But at night, right, there's very few, like there aren't very many street lamps, and you're driving large, long expanses of just dark roads. And it's kind of one of those things, like you get to the other side of it, and you're just like happy that your car got you through it. But what Stephen King does is he almost creates this vibe of like, obviously growing up in Maine as well, he must have had this mindset of like, well, what would happen if our car broke down and we had to knock on this door over here? Or a lot of times you'll see random people just walking on those streets. And it's like, what happens if that person walking flags you down and you get them in the car with you? And then what could happen from there? And so he kind of takes, almost kind of similar to what you did with When Darkness Falls, where he takes the beauty that you get in Maine during the day, and he makes it the sinister thing that it is at night, that we kind of always growing up in Maine sort of experience, but we just sort of get to the other side of it and just, again, are happy that our car made it through. And he just said, kind of always is painting that picture of like what happens if your car doesn't make it. And I kind of sense that in kind of all of his horror. But that was something I appreciated about When Darkness Falls, is that it had a similar vibe to it, in that sense of like what happens when, and in this case, it's Michaela's friend goes missing and she's got to find her. Suddenly she's stuck in this environment and she has to kind of deal with this situation in a way that she, wouldn't have wanted to.
Yeah, and I think some of the best, or certainly the most disturbing, horrors tend to draw on that. You've got stuff like Wolf Creek or The Hitcher or even The Wicker Man, where you've got someone stuck somewhere that people wouldn't usually imagine people would be stuck, but it becomes all the more horrifying when you do find yourself in one of those what-if situations.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the kind of thing that we were inspired by. We were kind of, because, our goal with kind of moving away, I guess, or trying to move away from, going via a distributor from the beginning and doing that kind of thing, is that, you mention nuns and then they just want The Conjuring or The Nun. They want jump scares, they want this, that, and it's got to have a jump scare every 5 minutes. So we definitely wanted to move away from that. And, we're both quite drawn to, things like The Shining. So, horrors that are built on atmosphere and just that, progressive sense of dread. So that's a very big part of what we're going for in the film.
Yeah, and I can kind of see, right, like, again, where you'd have that fear of wanting something to be taken from you by a distributor, right? Because you're right, like you again, think about When Darkness Falls, like I do wonder if that was something that you both didn't have the creative control to make the way you wanted to make it, like what little things that they would have done to it that it would have lost its identity and it wouldn't have come out as solid of a film.
Yeah, and I think that the distributors, particularly on the sort of lower budget end of the scale, although I imagine even in Hollywood and the kind of bigger budget productions, seem to have this sort of clinical checkbox approach where it must do X, Y, and Z and it must not deviate from that path. But that by its very nature inhibits creativity and anyone coming up with anything new or original. And I mean, obviously When Darkness Falls isn't it's well worn ground from the perspective of the setup, so you end up, you try and do something different with what direction it goes in. But I think that the problem is with tick box exercises is you're never going to create something that stands out. And what we discussed about films finding it more difficult to stand out in the digital age, why would your sort of mode of operation be to then just create a bunch of cookie cutter movies that are exactly like the one before it? I don't get that way of thinking. Surely the way to differentiate yourself is by standing out, by doing something different, and going down the route of creating that sense of dread as opposed to going the sort of, I don't want to say cheap shot route of jump scares, because I do like a jump scare, but I think it probably takes a bit more talent to craft something like Rosemary's Baby or The Shining, where you're building up that sense of, oh no, what's going to happen here?
Yeah, and I think too, like to your point about like, the Marvel movies, for example, where they've got to check the boxes. It's like, I remember Thor Ragnarok was sold as this like offbeat version of a Marvel movie. And to some extent it was, but it was like it hit all the same marks that it's supposed to hit, right? Main character starts off with a challenge that, he makes his way out of. Okay. Now main character moves on to something else. Okay. Main character finds himself in a situation he needs to get out of. Okay. All hope is lost right now, but he kind of is figuring it out. Okay. He solves this one. Now it's, fighting the big bad guy. And now again, all hope is lost for like 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, where everybody is about to lose. And then suddenly they find a way to win. And it kind of hits all those marks. And I think, again, like with a movie like When Darkness Falls, it doesn't quite do that. But I think also the thing is too, like when you talked about, getting outside of the mold or not wanting to again, just check off all the boxes, I think it can't be different for the sake of being different. I think it's one of the things that worked about When Darkness Falls was that all the ways that it was different from the usual thriller, it was different organically, in the sense that, like, as a member of the audience, I would go there with you as you're taking me there. And, I'm getting things that I'm not expecting, but there are things that I'm not expecting, but like I get it, like I'm okay with it going there. And I think that's the most important thing, is that, like, it's not just different for the sake of different. And it's like, so you're challenging yourselves to make something that's not just a cookie cutter, like you said, with a bunch of jump scares and everything. But then when you pull it off, right, from an audience standpoint, I come out of it watching it saying, okay, I just got a different experience from what I've had recently, and almost like appreciate it more, right, that I was taken on that journey like that. And so I think that when it works, it can just be so much better than sort of, like you said, kind of following the checking off all the boxes approach.
Yeah, and I think the slight risk that we've got with Baby in the Basket, you want to be creative, you want to put a lot of thought into, the proceedings, what's going on. I mean, Tom's even given each of the characters very subtly one of the 7 deadly sins. Whether the audience pick up on that or not, is up to the individual. But if you look deeper, that's there. But I guess it's treading the line between doing something creative and a bit different and coming across as pretentious, because a lot of art house. I mean, I'm not a huge art house fan, but sometimes, you watch things and you think, what was the point in that? Were they just trying to make something so different? But then you deviate so far from the path of it being a watchable movie. That's something that we don't want to do, like you say, is being different for the sake of it. You've got to kind of try and stand out, but in a good way, and not come across as someone that's just, doing something to go, oh, look, this is really different from anything else. Yeah, but it's got to be good as well.
Yeah, and I think, like Rosemary's Baby is a great example, because it's funny, I mean, Rosemary's Baby was made in the late 60s, and yet it's a kind of horror movie that you don't see much anymore. And it is interesting, like, my wife likes to watch it kind of every year around Halloween. It's because it's one of her favorite movies. So I've seen it more now than I used to. I mean, I saw it like way back in the past, but now I watch it with her. And there are a lot of little pieces that I pick up that I that I hadn't caught before. Like, like Nick Cassavetes' character, the way or John Cassavetes' character, sorry, the way he is in that film. It enhances the film in a way that a lot of horror movies, I don't think they know quite how to do it, right? You've got this sort of cheeseball male character with the kind of final girl character that I think Mia Farrow is supposed to be. But, that cheeseball character can't just be a one-note cheeseball. Like, there's got to be some more going on there for it to work. And it is interesting. I think a lot of people who watch movies like that, they kind of just think, okay, the big thing about Rosemary's Baby is the end, right? The fact that we don't see what the baby looks like, and what a great genius move that was. But you're right that really the genius in Rosemary's Baby is the slow burn and taking us through all of those steps and getting us to stick with Mia Farrow throughout the film like that.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that Tom and I discussed for the Baby in the Basket was, how much of the baby or the actual entity do we show? And I think we've reached a really good compromise, and that sort of compromise is justified by the fact that, you don't know whether it's the nuns going mad or whether it's actually reality. But we felt for today's audiences, we had to show something, but, not take it too far. I mean, another recent film that was quite good from that perspective was Saint Maud, because it was a little bit bizarre, but it wasn't all reliant on jump scares. But we seem to have entered this, when you're talking about cliche horror movie characters, I think certainly the writing back in the past, Tom aside, obviously, was a lot better. But we've kind of entered this weird sort of meta stage where instead of sort of just making the characters cliches, the tongue's firmly in cheek and people know they're cliches. So it's like, yeah, this guy's the jock, and we know he's the jock. He knows he's the jock. The audience know he's the jock. We're just playing with it now. So with the Scream sequels and stuff like that, we seem to have entered almost this sense of self-awareness where those films stop being cool or stop being interesting, and now they're suddenly interesting again because we know what they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think of like one of the Hatchet movies that I watched, because I was trying to really go with those movies because again, I like the idea of them, but I remember there was a scene where two characters are on a boat, like going out to wherever the area where is the main, the baddie is, and they were having this conversation where it was like you said, it's kind of this overly meta thing where they're talking about, oh, your character's name's Chad, you must have been a jock, and oh, you must have been a redneck or something like that, and it's like you said, it's like, instead of like kind of creating something different or like it's almost like they like you said, it's a very tongue-in-cheek approach to having the cookie cutter characters.
Yeah, and I mean, I've kind of used that myself as well. I've got a kind of action thriller coming up where it's actually a sequel, but it's a little bit more kind of knowing than the first one in a way. And the two guys are sitting in the car and they're saying stuff like, I hate when you enter a room, you're trying to be all stealthy, and then someone knocks you out from behind with a gun butt to the neck. And it happens all the time. And they're talking about that, and then it happens later on in the movie, and they're kind of like, I wondered when that was going to show up. So there's that sort of like, the dying with two guns, running away from explosions. You've seen it all a million times. So why not, be a bit self-referential and let the audience know that, yes, we know we've seen this before. It's just funny now because we're admitting that we've seen it before, kind of thing.
Yeah, I almost kind of feel like you can get away with it more with action because it's almost like with like action, you almost like you enjoy it more, right? Like when the movie is that like kind of self-aware, whereas like I think like going back to When Darkness Falls, I think with with Michaela's character, in that where she's very type A and she's kind of by the book, and we get to see this sort of metamorphosis with her character. I think it was kind of fun to watch her character break out of the shell of what we expect that character to be, and the way it happens sort of organically and how she's sort of mitigating that. But then I think kind of they do the same thing with a few of the characters in that film. I don't want to talk about it too much because I don't want to give too much away. But I think with horror, right? Like I think it's almost like too much of that meta thing has been happening. Whereas with action, it doesn't happen enough. I think with action, it's almost like kind of a more fun thing that like if I'm watching the movie, right? Like you said, the characters joke about that, like, or, there's so many different cliches that come up, like the guy who's working security who gets shot with the silencer gun, when the baddies show up to take over the building. Like, there's almost something kind of fun about it. Like, if the character is, the security character is like, boy, this job is just so boring, but, I sometimes I want something to happen, and then somebody comes in and shoots him, and it's like, it's always the security guard who gets it, or something. It almost kind of works in a different way with action, whereas with horror, it seems like you said, like it's almost like been too much of it.
Yeah, and I think certainly that's something that we're not going to do with Baby in the Basket, because it's not it's not like a slasher movie, or it's not, I wouldn't say it's a genre that can be sort of a subgenre that can be sort of spoofed as easily. I mean, I know that you've got the scary movie films and everything like that kind of collectively looked at horror films and sent them up, but I think we are probably going to approach this from a 100% serious standpoint. And I think the characters are probably interesting and different enough that we haven't kind of taken that meta approach or that tongue-in-cheek approach. But I think that is essential to maintaining that sense of dread and whatnot. I think you kind of have to know what you're making. You have to know when you're making a goofy action film, and then you have to know when, to take something a bit more seriously.
Yeah, and I think almost too, maybe from a writing standpoint, the meta approach with the horror films, it's almost like I don't want to say it can almost kind of be a lazy thing even, right? Where it's like, I'm making this one-dimensional character as a joke, and instead of having to write the characters more three-dimensional. I think, the way Tom, wrote When Darkness Falls with those characters, and I think, kind of Nathan, the way you were kind of approaching the story there with them, that you get these sort of organic changes with them, and so. And I don't even know that they necessarily start out as one notes, because even kind of the exposition, we get a better sense of them. But it's harder, I think, to write characters that three-dimensional and have them develop throughout the course of a 90 100 minute film. That it's almost easier to just say like, no, you know what, this character is going to be the type A personality who does everything right, and we're going to give them some glasses and maybe kind of two plaited hair braids, or something like that, and just sort of make them be a caricature of that, as opposed to making them something a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I think it was House of Wax, the remake that's got Paris Hilton in it. I remember thinking at the time, all of these I mean, I don't know if they were meant to be a cliche. I don't know if, because you've got the jock, you've got the kind of cocky jock tends to be taken out pretty sharpish because of that, and that's the sort of revenge, and they're obviously trying to be slightly ironic with that. And then the sort of the quieter female lead tends to be the one that goes nuts at the end and is covered in blood. But I remember watching House of Wax and thinking, why is it always like teenagers in a forest in these slasher movies? Why can't we have like it's a group of old people or something like that? Why has no one done that? Like a group of old people in a retirement home with this serial killer going around, or this person stalking people. It's like, they haven't kind of thought out of the box very much. And like you're saying, the meta thing's becoming a bit of a cliche in itself, but there's opportunities there to kind of flip that on its head again and go, actually, why don't we just have a film where it's, OAPs being stalked instead of these, hot young blonde chicks who also happen to be in bikinis or whatever,
Well, that's going to be our next one now, I think now, yeah.
Yeah.
Quite like that idea.
Well, I mean, Renegades is a great example too, right? Of like, okay, we've got older actors, right? Like, Billy Murray,
Yeah.
like like this idea that like, okay, well, Billy Murray can only be like some old gangster patriarch character, right? Which, I mean, he does a really great job of that in Nemesis. So I don't want to say like he never, it's not a good thing that he plays that, but this idea that like that's what Billy Murray does now. And in Renegades, it's like, no, we're going to give him an eye patch and have him go around and shoot people and be, a kind of an action star there. And like you said, there's almost like this idea of like, well, elderly people can only play certain things in movies, but like, yeah, there's a lot you could do with the elderly in a horror movie, right? And even kind of as you're talking about this character in Baby in a Basket, who's a veteran of World War II. I mean, that could even be part of the process. I mean, I guess at this stage, I guess maybe the movie would have to take place a little bit further in the past, because World War II is far enough, now that they probably wouldn't be so many in a restaurant. They'd be close to their hundreds. But yeah, I think it's a kind of this thing that like, no, it's always got to be teens. And, here in America, they've always got to shoot it kind of, like you said, like in a forest location. And that's what the movie has to be.
Yeah. I mean, I get this from from working with a lot of distributors that, they want those kind of linear ideas, and they want the things that you've seen before, hundreds of times. But again, with the characters, they prefer it kind of simple and two-dimensional, where, you have a clearly defined character. Maybe there'll be some growth, throughout for like maybe the main character or the final girl, but the kind of, the characters around that main character would tend to be, sort of cardboard cutouts, really. And that's the kind of way they expect it. And I think, I just think maybe sometimes distributors kind of underestimate, how well a good movie will sell, just by being good, how much of a selling point that can be.
Well, that's what I always say. If you've got a good movie, I'm not saying that it markets itself, but it will find the audience. And because of, social media, TikTok, whatever, I mean, the only reason that a lot of these Netflix shows are, raved about or get up the top of Netflix is because people start talking about them. Some people start watching them, realize they're good, word of mouth spreads to other people. So, to me, if a movie's good, then it will find its audience, I think, the majority of the time. But I mean, going back to the sort of, giving people the roles that they're expected to play, I think, and I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here because I can't really think of any examples, but some of the more off-the-wall casting choices where you're like, what is that actor doing playing that role? Maybe Colin Firth in The Kingsman, or, Helen Mirren popping up as Statham's mum in the Fast and Furious movies. You're like, that is interesting, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure. I know. I mean, I remember Vin Diesel. I think he talked about like he really wanted to work with Judi Dench in a film, and so he cast her in one of those Chronicles of Riddick movies. And I think that's part of it, right? Is that like, yeah, you're not expecting to see her in a or like you're expecting to see Helen Mirren in Fast and the Furious, and it does work in that sense, because I think the actors themselves enjoy doing it, right? They enjoy Helen Mirren. You get a sense that she's enjoying playing a part outside of like what she's expected to do. It's almost like she's doesn't want to keep getting the same roles all the time too.
Well, someone once actually told me that, if you're looking for like an indie film, if you're looking to get someone on board, sometimes people will literally just do it because they've never been offered the role. I mean, apparently Patrick Stewart did the role as that neo-Nazi bad guy in Green Room because he's like, well, no one's ever offered me the chance to play that. It's so against type that he was like, yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. So I think that actors appreciate that, and I've heard of lots of different actors that have said yes to parts just because no one's ever asked them to play anything like that before.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because I think it was Ian McKellen who got, or I'm trying to think who was in the Richard III movie that was took place in sort of like a Nazi version of England. And
yeah, that might have been McKellen. Yeah,
Ian McKellen, right? And so then he started getting roles as a Nazi, right? Like he played a Nazi in a couple of movies. And it's like the thing, it's like once somebody sees it once, suddenly they just kind of latch onto it. But then you're right, like it's like, well, everybody sees Patrick Stewart as Captain Picard, and they don't want to cast him in something like that. It's like almost like somebody has to do it once for and then everybody wants to do it with them, or they want to do that film with them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think specifically when it comes to villains, people that you're not used to seeing in those sort of roles, it can sometimes be all the more disturbing and effective seeing them play parts like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. Oh, Tom, were you gonna jump in?
Oh no, I agree. Yeah, I think when you see someone doing something really unexpected, against their type, it's really interesting. But I guess there's a lot of actors that they prefer to stick to a type quite rigidly, and they would maybe feel uncomfortable kind of venturing out. But I think those kind of actors that appreciate it, you can kind of tell with their performances that they're really kind of having fun with it. And I think, like Nathan said, Patrick Stewart is a really good example in Green Room.
And I think that's probably a reason, going back to, playing any part, is probably a reason for not turning things down, because if you're known as one thing and someone gives you the opportunity to play something, that allows you to kind of explore the character more, do something that you've never done before, I think that's probably quite appealing.
Yeah, and it is interesting because, a lot of times when I'm reviewing a movie, I'll see an actor that, hadn't seen anything else before. And when I go to their IMDb page, they put their reel up. And it is interesting to your point about that one actor who didn't want to have the drug addict character in there because they were afraid of losing out on commercial roles, because it does seem like it's more often that it's the other way around, that when you see those demo reels, it's not the one note character that they did in the horror movie that they put a lot of emphasis on. It's that those characters they played where they kind of really were able to stretch themselves, and they want you to see that when they see the demo reel.
Yeah, absolutely, because that obviously kind of shows a bit of range. And I would people say to me, can we not include a crying scene in the film so I can put that in my showreel? And you're thinking, no, but you're not looking at it from the right perspective. If somebody watches a showreel, they should see good acting and range. It's not like, oh yeah, I can turn on the waterworks. It's like, so what? So can I if you put some eye drops in my eyes, you know what I mean?
Yeah, right. There's that idea, right? Like you said, I think from an acting standpoint, right? Like the being able to cry on cue, right? That's sort of like the this sort of standard that, like, actors want to be able to show that they can cry on cue. But you're right that, like, there's so many other things that an actor needs to be able to do that, I think, again, like looking at When Darkness Falls, with sort of those characters where they kind of they evolve throughout the film, that there's almost like more put on them to sort of, kind of go through those different changes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, the more extreme the character, probably the more fun that people have. I mean, certainly, even when you look at someone like Dolph Lundgren in Universal Soldier, it looks as if he's having an absolutely fantastic time playing that part. So, Yeah, I think it's always what I mean. It kind of goes back to as well. If you get Eric Roberts in for a couple of days, you really want him to be doing, the sort of final analysis, or I can't think of the other film that I was thinking of, but the sort of Eric Roberts nutty hair slick back bad guy. You really want him to be doing an Eric Roberts. You don't want him to be coming in and giving him this really generic bit part that's quite clearly there just because he's, a name.
Yeah, or having him shoot his part on a web camera or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always joke with guys who come up with reviews podcasts about his sit down roles a lot of times that he does, where it's like he just kind of sits behind a desk and talks on the phone to people, and it's like you said, it's kind of like obviously he's not really interacting with anybody when he does that part.
Yeah, we had I actually worked for a distributor as well, and we reviewed, or you screen various different films, but there was one where I actually think that Amber might have been in it as well, and it was about, I think it was someone being harassed. They did this sort of call center job from home, and they were being harassed by this guy, and the guy was literally just Eric Roberts on the phone, so he literally phoned in his performance.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. I'll have to kind of tell them about that one because they would get a kick out of that he That's awesome. Now as we're kind of moving in, as we're talking about Baby the Basket. Now, this is something you guys are going to try to get crowdfunded. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, not to sort of talk about the burden of indie filmmaking too much, but when you are making stuff at this sort of level, it's very difficult to generate cash flow. And a lot of the time, if you're on some kind of a revenue share deal, even if the film does well, you're sort of waiting 12 months, 18 months, sometimes 2 years before any substantial revenue comes back. And when I say substantial, I mean in the thousands instead of the hundreds. So to be honest, not only are we trying to aim a little bit bigger with this film in terms of production values and just, a general overall bump in quality, it's also, I don't want to say to bridge a gap, but there was the necessity to go and try the crowdfunding route, just because as an indie filmmaker, generating that cash flow is sometimes near on impossible. I mean, I was probably naive to think that I could make a film for 10 grand, sell it for 20 grand, make a film for 20 grand, sell it for 40 grand. That doesn't happen, not at this level. So it's really to give us a bit of a step up, and hopefully people will appreciate what we're doing. Hopefully they'll appreciate that previously we have put our own money into things, but we're trying to grow and we're trying to make sure that we continue making films. And for this one, obviously we're just looking for a bit of a help. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Tom, or what your kind of perspective is on it.
Yeah, I think it's just we're just looking to make a film kind of with our own vision and not have it kind of watered down in any way. I mean, we could have gone the route of going to a distributor and getting interest from the beginning, but as we've sort of said, that it would be the kind of film that they might think, well, this isn't really going to be commercial enough from our perspective, or we'd want it simplified, because we wanted to do something with just a little bit more kind of layers to it. So as we sort of said, that we'd like it if people watch the film and then when they go kind of back and watch it again, they pick up these little things. So that's it really. I think we're just hoping to get a good response from sort of fellow indie filmmakers who have probably been in the same boat at some point. We still have a commercial eye on the film. We think that folk horrors are popular at the moment. Doing things which have a certain nostalgic quality to them, that's also quite popular. So we're not going completely off the rails and then expecting people to fund it. We're making something we think people will want to watch. I just think occasionally distributors can be a bit narrow-minded, and you can show them evidence to the contrary and they'll still think well, at least one of these nuns has to be a scary nun. You know, you've got to add all these things in. So, yeah, so hopefully we'll get a good response, and then, you know, we can make the movie. Yeah, so yeah, time will tell.
Yeah, and I think for people listening, I think the quality of When Darkness Falls, I think that being an indicator, I think for what you guys are capable of doing, I think it's worth putting the money behind this. I think for people that are thinking about, you know, supporting the crowdfunding, is that, you know, this isn't like just sort of like, yeah, right, you guys just sort of have an idea and you want to just do something that, like, you know, you've put out quality films before. And I think When Darkness Falls is a great example, because I think the idea of not wanting to have this run through distributors, and like you said, like I can see, like with the evil nun, right, that they want like a Nurse Ratched type nun or something, that you know, that isn't something that you're necessarily going for. I think your instincts worked with When Darkness Falls, and I think having a distributor get their hands on that one and alter that, I don't think it would have come out as well as it did. And I think probably the same thing with Baby in the Basket, is that I think the vision that you're both going for there, it's going to probably turn out much better with you doing it than, like you said, sort of sending it to distributor and having them kind of put their stamp on it.
Yeah, and it's a difficult thing, because, you know, Tom and I will make things and go, you know, look what we can do for this little money, what we've been able to kind of achieve production values wise, you know, and you kind of go, imagine we had, you know, $250,000 or something like that. Imagine the level of what we could make. But again, it kind of goes back to, you know, you see it with a lot of sort of directors that are emerging. They start off with some really, really, really good classic stuff, and then they get kind of embroiled in the studio system and make these big overblown films that are nothing like what made them great originally. And that's kind of something that, you know, it would be great to have 100 million to make a film, but as Tom said, you then are expected to check boxes and you know, do that to a certain kind of spreadsheet of details that must be delivered. And I think that basically what we are trying to do is create an independent production company where we can make commercial films. I mean, they've always got a commercial edge to us. That's always a consideration, but kind of on our own terms. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think Tom and I are both of the agreement that we don't want to sell our soul or, you know, put our name to anything, certainly not from a production perspective, that we actually feel we don't really want to do this, or we feel that we've kind of made someone else's film against our, you know, best wishes.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, also in terms of, you know, if you go with an idea to a distributor from, you know, ground zero, and you're trying to get the money to make the film, it's a lot more difficult to kind of persuade the money out of them with your vision. You know, if you go back to them with a completed film and it's a good film, which maybe kind of differs from their kind of range, they're more likely to be persuaded by it, you know, by seeing that complete film and kind of understanding the vision you want. So, you know, that's kind of in our thinking as well, that, you know, if we can make our film, we can attract maybe a range of distributors who might, you know, go for it.
Well, this thing, we had a funny one recently where we pitched a film to a company. I won't name project or names or anything, but the guy basically went, interesting concept, not really for us, but bring the completed film back to us when it's available for distribution, and we'll have a look. And you're thinking, so basically what you want to do is you don't want to take the risk in making the film, but you actually think it's quite a good idea, but you'd rather we just went and made it and brought you the completed film, just to see if you were backing the wrong horse or didn't back the horse that you should have. Or, you know, you're thinking, well, if you like the film in any capacity or the concept, you know, can you not at least put your neck on the line a little bit to help us make it? But I thought that was a really ironic response. Come back when it's finished, then I'll look at it.
Yeah. I get that there is an edginess at the moment with, you know, how the indie film industry is. So, you know, I sort of get it from their perspective, that they're quite, you know, hesitant on where they put their money and what they put their money into. So they kind of do, you know, that's why they lean very much towards the safe angle, particularly in the kind of the realm we're in at the moment. You these movies that are under kind of, you know, $500,000.
Yeah, and I can see too, I guess, like, you know, that, yeah, like distributors like that, yeah, they want something that's safer. I mean, it is interesting because, yeah, I guess, you know, I guess I in my head, I think because, you know, again, myself and a lot of people that listen to the podcast that are kind of just movie fans don't know full, you know, as much how it works, right? And there's always this I think for me, one of the biggest things I learned when I started doing these films and started talking to, or started, you know, doing my site and started talking to filmmakers, is that we grow up with this idea, especially people, myself, were born in like the late 70s and grew up kind of in the 80s and 90s, this idea of this auteur-driven film industry that, like, okay, Martin Scorsese makes a movie and he, you know, or Quentin Tarantino makes a movie, and it's like their concept and their vision that just kind of goes through the whole thing. And it was kind of a wake-up call to learn that, like, that's not really how the bulk of movies are made, and that it can be hard, right, when you have a vision to sort of be able to see that vision through the way that you want to.
Yeah, and I mean, those sorts of directors are few and far between. There's very, very, very few people that get to, you know, to have their creative vision, have it picked up by a studio. I mean, if Tarantino submits a film and it's 3.5 hours, you can't imagine the producers taking it off him and going, yeah, no, we're just going to cut this down to 85 minutes. That just wouldn't happen. It's like a Tarantino film. It's, you know, you just don't touch it. And I think there's very few directors that have got that level of clout where by the distributor either accepts that they've got this kind of style of filmmaking or a fan base and they just don't touch their end product because they have so much faith in it. Oh, it's a Scorsese film, you can't edit it down to 2.5 hours, or it's a Tarantino film, you can't take this out of it, it's Tarantino. I mean, there's very, very, very few people that have that privilege in the film industry.
Yeah, and even Scorsese. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, it's becoming even less so now as everything kind of gets dominated by, you know, that rigid kind of Disney model of, you know, a lot of these films. So, you know, it was why Scorsese took so long to get The Irishman made, and it's getting harder for even, you know, guys like that to kind of get their films made. I mean, there has been a slight rise again in this kind of middle level of like A24 types of movie. This sort of, I guess, like 5 million to 10 million, 15 million range kind of film, where you get these slightly younger auteurs. So, yeah, that's come back slightly, but it's almost like an ebb and a flow. So there was a little peak and then it kind of went down a bit again. It's just, you don't know whether it's going to keep rising. And I think, you know, the bigger that something like A24 gets, for example, they're becoming more and more, I guess they're almost becoming a bit more mainstream, and the bigger their movies get, it's almost becoming a little bit more elitism again. So they're almost becoming like a studio in the sense of, you know, Fox, Disney, and, you know, all the rest.
Fortunately, they've kind of managed to keep the quality there, and the general sort of, you know, love of films still shines through, even in their bigger stuff. I mean, they've just swept the board at the Oscars, haven't they?
Yeah. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if they can keep that you know, that method and that quality. And, you know, I think sometimes there's a tendency in the last couple of years, I've noticed it creeping in, where it's almost, I don't know, it's not quite a meta thing, but it's almost like, you know, people are trying very hard to fit the A24 mold by being kind of very art house or very quirky, or, you know, they're trying to tick certain boxes that make it an art, you know, an A24 kind of film. So there's a danger that, you know, they start releasing too many films that are almost like a pastiche of what they do.
And I guess that's something that we kind of talked about as well, Tom, about Baby in the Basket, of not falling into that trap of obscurity or, you know, that sort of oddity for the sake of it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, you know, we want to have a bit of subtext and a bit, you know, a few layers, but it's, you know, not at the expense of an actual, you know, engaging plot line that takes you from start to finish.
Yeah, I think that's kind of important, because I think, you know, it is interesting with, like, you talk about with the A24 thing, and kind of with the movies themselves. I mean, my first time back in the theater after, you know, the pandemic, because I went and saw the Coen production of Macbeth that had Denzel Washington in the lead. And I think actually that was where I first saw the trailer for Everything, I always get the title mixed up with that. It's Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think is what I want to call it. But
yeah, that's it. Yeah,
that was when I first saw the trailer for that, and I thought, wow, that looks like it could be interesting. I like Michelle Yeoh, but I never ended up watching it. But then it was like one of those things where it was like you kept hearing about it more, and it kind of built on itself. But I think you're right that there's that I think I remember kind of post Tarantino in the 90s where post Pulp Fiction in the 90s where it was like suddenly so many indie films were like, pre Tarantino in the early 90s, you had so many different types of indie movies and they would, kind of cover a lot of different categories. But then it just became either these gangster films where it was like, I think, Terrence Stamp and the Limey, those kinds of movies where it was like, let's figure out different ways we can shoot things, tell the story in a unique way, but have these sort of gangster-like characters and get actors like Travolta, who, we weren't expecting in that kind of role. Or it was a lot of these sort of angsty male characters with troubled women characters. And like, let's see these angsty males navigate these troubled women situations. And it was almost like, they, like you said, it kind of became this pastiche of a couple different types of movie. And I think that is a fear, right? That's like, you're either going to be the blockbuster Marvel movie or you're going to be this A24 thing that people are expecting to be an indie art house film. And I think it's another area, right, where it's like, again, thinking about, When Darkness Falls, it doesn't really fit either of those categories. It's just a solid movie that just kind of does what you want that movie to do. And it's weird, I think, from a moviegoer standpoint. Maybe the distributors don't think there's enough people out there that just want to watch a solid movie that just is what it is and doesn't have to fit, either one of those buckets.
Yeah, and I think myself, when I'm kind of looking for things, unless it's a film I've come across before or seen before, that's a classic like Con Air. Everyone's seen Con Air. You know what you're going to get when you're watching a Marvel movie or to a certain extent a James Bond movie or a Mission Impossible. But even these days, I'll stick on something random based on the synopsis, and a lot of the time it's not even got any name cast in it these days. And I get to the end and I'm like, that was actually really good, and I'm weirdly surprised, and I don't know why. But a lot of the time you're like, that was actually a really good film, and probably I would never have thought to watch that. But I've kind of fallen more now into the mindset of actually looking for something a bit different or something that people are not talking about as much. And that's one of the things that distributors, specifically on this level, but I suppose even at a slightly higher level, concept actually is almost as valuable as name stars. Because if you get if you look at Terrifier 2, for example, and the huge success that has been, it's no name. I would assume it's no name. I mean, I don't know. It's a sequel. It's based on the concept, and a lot of concept movies, okay, so Cocaine Bear's got some well-known faces in it, but purely a concept film, and distributors seem to be placing a lot more value on those these days on the strength of the concept as opposed to the actors that they can get on board. Because you get someone like Mel Gibson or formerly Bruce Willis in for a few days, and that's not holding as much value as it is before, because a lot of the time they're not good movies. A lot of the time they've gotten these guys in for a couple of days and slapped them front and center on the cover. And a lot of the time, it's not that they're phoning it in because they've chosen to phone it in. It's because they've not given them an interesting part in any way or description, and they've thought getting a couple of names in is enough to sell the film. And I think audiences are getting kind of wise to that mismarketing now and are looking for films where the concept's interesting as opposed to going, oh, that's got Bruce Willis in it, because I think they've had their fingers burned too many times where they come out of the film or they've watched it on Prime or whatever and went, that was rubbish.
Yeah, and I think it's almost where the cynicism comes in too. So it's like, yeah, I mean, like the Bruce Willis aspect, it's like I'll watch a trailer for a Bruce Willis movie, one of these, Emmett Furlow Oasis productions, and I'll be like, well, this looks like he's got a main part in this. I don't know how they're going to write him out of it. And then I watch the movie and they do. And it's almost like kind of creative the way that they do it. But there are a lot of things that end up happening in those movies as a result where it's like, okay, well, we can't have Bruce Willis in, so let's do this huge scene of padding here. And it's just like, a limo scene where the dialogue goes on for 10 minutes, and it probably doesn't need to be that long. And of course, 10 minutes of dialogue feels like so much more. And I think that's the problem.
I know the scene that you're talking about as well. But that's the thing. I mean, the sort of go-to is let's have Bruce Willis tied to a chair for the majority of the film. I mean, I swear he was actually tied to the exact same chair for 3 films in a row, because they've obviously realized that's the way to get the most out of him for his 3 days in the one location. So they capture him after the first action scene and he gets out for the final action scene, but he's in this sort of like direct to video tied to a chair jail for the the middle hour of the film.
Right. And there's no real suspense in that either, right? It's more just like, okay, now we've got this younger actor who's doing the heavy lifting who has to go find him, right? And find out what's happening there. And then it's like, usually he has some sort of group with him that's part of it. And I don't know if you call it suspense and knowing how many of that group gets killed off in different shootouts in between then. And it's almost like you said, like it's like that's the device that they've all kind of glommed onto, right, as a way to get Bruce Willis out of the film for large periods of time.
Yeah, and it's difficult really, because if you've got someone for 2 or 3 days and you want to kind of pepper them throughout the film to make it seem like they're in it more than they actually are, there's only a kind of limited number of scenarios you can actually do. Actually, what the best thing to do would be just to write a good film and go, okay, so that character's in it a fair bit, let's get a name in for them kind of thing. But it all seems completely geared towards how little time they can shoot with a star, but for kind of maximum impact. But I think people are getting wise to that. And, whether that kind of results in a bit of a change in terms of indie films getting a bit more interest because they're good or because they've got a good concept, I'm not too sure. And I don't really know where that leaves, actors like, well, Bruce Willis doesn't matter now too much, unfortunately. But, on that same level, I don't really know where it leaves them. Do the production budgets keep going down, but they pay them the same money and the films just get worse? I don't know. It's almost like at some point you would expect it all to come to a head and people go, actually, do you know what? Let's just go back to making good movies again.
Yeah, and I think there's almost like a law of diminishing returns as well. Like, I mean, with the Bruce Willis thing, there was this mindset of like they kind of knew his condition was deteriorating, so they wanted to get as many films in as they could. But there is that sense of like, okay, well now there's 12 Bruce Willis movies that came out in 2022. How does anybody even see them all? And I know, like, I've been doing with this podcast with Ty from Comas Reviews. We've kind of glommed onto this approach where we just pick a couple of those movies and discuss them. And it's almost like people want to figure out how to make sense of this, that they want to listen to the podcast and get a sense of it. But I think there is also an appetite, like you said, for like just quality, earnest filmmaking, right? That like, because when it comes through, right? And I'm not saying like, I mean, that's the other thing too with those Bruce Willis movies is that there's a crew there that like, has to put in a 16-hour day because Bruce Willis is only shooting his scenes in one day. They've got to start way early in the morning, pack things up way at night. And then they look at this, this end result and it's like they kind of did the best they could in playing the, in doing their part as part of the production. But like you said, the movie at the end of it is just it's something that has to be edited in an awkward way to pad it out properly. And so I think that's the other part of it. Like from a professional standpoint, I think everybody wants to take pride in their work, and to be able to see the end result be something that's actually like really good, I think helps in that sense.
Yeah, and it's a shame that they didn't, obviously there was various producers and directors and whatnot that must have been aware of his condition and because of how, things had to be done on set. But it's a shame that no one thought, you know what, let's take the time and actually give Bruce Willis a couple of really good roles if these are the last movies that he's going to make, because unfortunately the final legacy that he's left behind is this slew of really poorly produced, poorly conceived action movies. I mean, I think the only person that actually tried to do something a bit different with him was Jesse V. Johnson in White Elephant. And, good writers and, good producers and whatnot will work around a situation like that to get the best out of it instead of just going, let's just have him in a chair again, and that will get around that, because unfortunately, it doesn't do justice to Bruce Willis and what a great actor he was, and a great presence back in the day. It almost seems like, I mean, I get why he was doing them, because he's obviously trying to make a quick buck before he has to give it up, and you can't condemn him for that after years of quality performances. But you think on the producer side they would at least have tried to give him a decent send off in some of these films.
Yeah, because there's almost a feeling about Sean Malloy, who does a podcast. I Must Break This podcast. It's like a Dolph Lundgren one. He was saying to me that like he was looking at one of the trailers for one of those later Willis films, and he felt like there's almost like a Bela Lugosi and Plan 9 from outer space kind of thing, where like Ed Wood is just sort of propping him up to get as much out of him to make that movie. That they were kind of doing the same thing, and you're right that like maybe one or two solid performances, or like I think the way Tom wrote in Michael Pere's part or Danny Trejo's part, that like if they'd written in a more organic part for him as opposed to a part that has to like kind of be there and then disappear, or like like right, that they use the construct of him being tied to a chair, that like anything that's a little bit more organic and feels a little bit better actually works. And maybe even for Bruce Willis, he might have appreciated it more to have a role like that.
Yeah, and obviously I know that Bruce Willis's condition was, reflected in his performances, but I think Mel Gibson seems to be the new kind of go-to for Emmett Furlong, Danny Trejo and Renegades. Obviously, he was not in it for a huge amount of time, but it looks as if he's having great fun, and you got to kind of give a bit of credit to those actors that they can be surrounded by some not so great elements, like some of the recent Bruce Willis movies from Emmett Furlong or whoever, but Mel Gibson, but Mel Gibson still puts in a performance regardless, and that's one thing that I kind of noticed watching a couple of recent Mel Gibson movies. You're like, he's way better than this material.
Yeah, that was something that we talked about when we did Hot Seat, the one that he did with Kevin Dillon, where we're like, he was reminding us of that 90s like huge screen presence when he's doing these roles, and it is, I mean obviously a big reason why he's in these movies is he's kind of he's kind of set himself out there as a sort of anti-Semitic, chauvinistic, racist, all those kinds of things. And so obviously at that stage, if he like he should be a villain in a Marvel movie, but Disney couldn't afford to touch him. They can't afford to have him. And so for us, we kind of are in this place where it's like, yeah, we know he's done all these really bad things, but at the same time, the performance he's giving here is good. It's almost like you kind of just lay the two side by side. I think you were talking about the kind of the cancel thing earlier, and it's almost like you don't forgive Mel Gibson for the attitudes and the things that he's done. You just more like, okay, I'm going to take that here, and then I'm also going to take what his performance is here and look at the two together in tandem. But it means like we get him in these Emmett Furlong movies that we shouldn't necessarily be having him in those movies, but we get him, and it kind of just makes the film unique in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same about Force of Nature. I watched that, and sort of Mel Gibson's doing this really great invested performance, and you're going, do you know that you're in an Emmett Furlong movie, and there's probably no need to make that much effort? No one would really bother if it wasn't like that. But you got to say, you got to hand it to him for that. I mean, I think that everybody kind of deserves a second chance on some level. Mel Gibson probably burned a few bridges and had probably a few more second chances than most. But, at the end of the day, he is a great talent, and, his presence and stuff like that is just something that you don't get these days. And I think he's probably tried to work his way back up, and I think that the guy's probably genuinely remorseful. I mean, and the whole setting of Hollywood probably sends people a bit stir crazy, and some people choose to be reclusive or shut themselves away from it and not grant interviews, and other people kind of go off the rails. I guess everyone deals with it in their own way, but unfortunately Mel Gibson was one of the ones that kind of went off the rails.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, what it does, right, is it means, I think that's the thing, is that like if you're making a big production like a Disney movie, you don't really have any choice, right? Everybody's got to have their ducks in a row, and they've got, you can't have anybody that could potentially, cause a furor about, their inclusion in the film. But, for Emmett Furlong or Oasis, that's not really a big deal for them. The benefit of having Mel Gibson's face on the tin is fine for them, and that the backlash isn't going to be as heavy for the people that are watching those movies. And I think that they can kind of take it. So it's almost like, everybody, like the Disney's lost, because I think Mel Gibson would be fantastic in a Marvel movie. I mean, he belongs with, the other actors that are in those movies, but, it's sort of like their loss is Emmett Furlow Oasis's gain. And then we get to kind of see this interesting, I don't know, this I don't know what the right term is, but it's just sort of this unique output here where you get somebody of that quality performing in these scenes and putting in this performance that you don't expect.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like Oliver Reed or Michael Caine and some of the bizarre film choices that they made in the 70s and 80s. We are thinking, what are they doing in this film?
Yes. Yeah, I think Oliver Reed recently on TV in the States. They played, I think it's Curse of the Werewolf, or it's a Hammer film that he did where he's a werewolf, and it is kind of funny that you're just like, boy, at some point Oliver Reed is going to turn into a werewolf. Like he's going to, he's going to have the hair on his face and the claws, all that stuff, and he's going to be howling and running around as a werewolf. And it's almost like you're just like, it's funny enough when you see it in a normal movie, but then you're like, oh boy, this is going to happen to Oliver Reed at some point. Like it's going to happen. And when it does, you're just like, and I mean, I guess he was younger for a Hammer movie, so maybe it's not so bad, but it still is kind of like a little jarring to see that.
Yeah.
He probably dialed it back when he was in, when he turned into a werewolf.
Yeah, I mean, it's never going to beat his performance on one of those late night talk shows where he comes on with a huge jug of vodka and orange and starts singing Wild Thing or something like that. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's always interesting. I think, it is interesting with the direct-to-video world when you see names kind of come down, and for whatever reason you see them coming down. I mean, Christian Slater's a great example where it's like, he was never quite like a huge star, but he was a big enough star. And then there was a period before he did, was it Mr. Robot? Was that the show? The one at USA, something like that.
Yeah, Mr. Robot.
Yeah, and he was doing direct-to-video movies in between there, and there's one where he has a fight scene with Colm Meaney, which was just kind of hilarious. Nobody was seeing that coming, but it's interesting sort of how actors kind of fall into that level. I mean, I guess in the 60s and 70s it was like a Hammer movie or a Grindhouse film that they would fall into and do those movies. So direct-to-video is kind of the new version of that, and it. I think for the sort of the actors that are kind of just trying to make their way in the business, to be able to act opposite a Mel Gibson or someone like that is always like probably a big treat for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You kind of get Christian Slater's one of those guys that hasn't really seen that renaissance, but then you get, for every kind of Christian Slater, you get a Nicolas Cage that was making these sort of really generic direct-to-video movies, and then I think someone must have just went, wait, we've got Nicolas Cage playing these really generic characters, and he made stuff like Mandy and Pig, and he's got great reviews for those. And even Christopher Lee, if you're talking about the Hammer movies, he suddenly ended up in huge blockbusters like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. So I think some actors have just really fortunately seen this, huge career revival, and it looks like it's Brendan Fraser's turn at the moment.
Yeah, that could be an interesting one, right? To kind of see what happens there. Yeah. Christopher Lee's a really great one because I didn't even think of that. Like, those Hammer movies where you're watching him in those, and then I think I remember when I first saw him in Attack of the Clones, I was like, that's Christopher Lee? Like what? And it wasn't like I had seen him in the commercials or anything, so it was a complete shock to me that he was there, and it was amazing kind of seeing him there.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of went from, that Hammer horror guy to, he was doing some really crazy things in his late career, like those sort of metal albums that he did as well. It's so random.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think it's one of the things about, the direct-to-video world and the independent film world, too, is that you see things that, like, you wouldn't expect. I think, I think, George Lucas putting Christopher Lee in his Attack of the Clones movie, that's probably part of him. I think he grew up watching those Hammer films, and I think he was probably influenced by them and said, I'm going to put him in this movie. But yeah, you kind of see a lot of different things that you don't see in your usual big budget blockbuster kind of thing, because again, those studios don't want to take the kind of chances that an independent film would want to take. But then again, like what you both were talking about, is then you've got to find a distributor who's willing to go there with taking that chance as well.
Yeah, and I think that, like Tom was saying, if you deliver that final product and they actually go, oh, that's actually quite good, they've then got faith in it. But you go to them with the concept and there's maybe a raised eyebrow there. I mean, I guess that's an advantage in some ways, is that you're not bound by the studio system. If you're an independent filmmaker, you can kind of go out and make what you want. Okay, sometimes you might get it wrong, or sometimes your vision doesn't turn out exactly the way you thought. But the problem with doing that is the money and the budget and the cash flow is not there a lot of the time to be able to give these independent filmmakers the facility to have their own production company that they then go to a distributor, and the distributors go, oh, actually that is a good film. And there's a kind of an irony in there that, when they return with the finished film, the distributors are then interested in it. But when it was at concept stage, it was kind of dismissed for being, going against the grain a little bit too much.
Yeah, and you think of like Star Wars is an interesting example of that, because it was like nobody knew what to make of that when they saw the script, because it was all in George Lucas's head, and then somebody took a chance on it, and the fact that it became such a huge thing, and of course nobody's expecting everybody's independent film to be Star Wars, but I think there is something to be said. I think again for distributors who've seen When Darkness Falls, and I guess maybe from the crowdfunding standpoint, for people that are having people kind of support you're making Baby in a Basket. I think something like When Darkness Falls is a great example where people can look at it and say, like, yeah, you know what, the quality was there in making that, and so it's worth it for people to back it, because you'd think a distributor would back what you're doing based on seeing that, but you're, like you said, they don't want to take the chance nowadays. They want to see the finished product, and then they'll decide if they want to distribute it.
Yeah, and all we're hoping for this one is that people do see the potential there, whether they've seen something that either Tom or myself have made before, or whether they're just going off the strength or the basis of the campaign. That's kind of what we're hoping people do, is just kind of see the passion there, see that we want to make something good, and hopefully donate a little bit of money to it.
Yeah, now as we're kind of wrapping up here, so this episode's going to be posted probably at when I think the campaign will have been out for a week or so, or maybe a few days when we post this, because this episode's going to post probably April 4th, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the campaign goes live on Friday the 31st of March, and we'll be having cast announcement, poster artwork, and the teaser trailer, which we've already shot, coming out just before the launch of the campaign. But we've got some videos and some updates and whatnot from the cast and crew during the duration of the campaign as well, which hopefully will keep people interested. So we are going to be kind of posting a lot and sharing a lot of stuff, hopefully. And I think Tom and myself have probably got some other bits and pieces, interviews lined up, and likewise with some of the cast as well.
Excellent. Yeah, and now so I'm going to have the link to where they can find the crowd, the campaign in the description of this podcast here when we release it. But do you have the URL for it now?
No, not at the moment, but you should just be able to go on to Kickstarter and search for The Baby in the Basket, and also I guess you can follow us on social media. The film is also being supported by movie website Flickering Myth as well, so you can go on there and there'll be lots of updates and exclusive interviews too.
Excellent. Yeah, and people know Flickering Myth just from Tom having been on before. That's a site that Tom writes reviews and articles for. So yeah, people should be familiar with that site.
Yeah, and I think they're kind of looking to make a transition into having a bit more involvement in the making of movies. So this will be kind of like a first for the website as well. So yeah, the first exciting step, I think, into making movies and helping to make movies.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's exciting. I mean, I definitely think people should. We've done a few different. We've had a couple of people on talking about different campaigns and films that they're doing, and I think this is definitely one that I definitely think people should support. I think just When Darkness Falls, I thought was an excellent movie, and I am excited to see what comes of Baby in a Basket, based, just because I'm highly anticipating it after seeing how great When Darkness Falls was.
Oh man, no pressure then, Tom, huh?
No, but I think at the very least, I think if people are curious, I mean, both of you are very competent making movies. I think that if anything, When Darkness Falls shows that you know what you're doing in making movies. So I think for people that are listening, knowing that you're both filmmakers that can produce high quality stuff, that the key thing is that you want to be able to make the movie the way you want to be able to make it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
That's the ideal scenario really for us, is to, if we can make it to our vision, then in theory we should deliver something I think people will enjoy. But all that pressure's on Nathan.
Excellent. Yeah, as we're wrapping up, anything else that either of you wanted to mention about the film?
I guess, got a great cast there. Some up and coming British talent. Hopefully, depending on how the campaign goes, we may get a couple of familiar faces in there. But as I say, that really hinges on the success of the campaign. And yeah, I mean, it's great to have support for indie filmmakers like ourselves. Via things like this podcast and anyone else that supports us. And I guess that at this sort of level, we really kind of need that to take us to the next level.
Yeah, and I think for people out there listening, I think it comes. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
I agree. Yeah, I think at this kind of level of filmmaking, you just need all those kind of voices that kind of promote these kind of films. It's just really important, in spreading the word, because there aren't that many avenues for filmmakers, I guess, below that $100 million mark. There's a big gap between $100 million and then people making movies for sort of less than $1 million, not much in the middle. So the ones kind of on making the small films, we need as many kind of avenues to get our films out there and our names out there as we can get.
Yeah, and I think for people out there sort of looking to back things, or I think one of the things it's funny, this guy John Cross, who he used to do a site called The After Movie Diner. He used to a podcast called The After Movie Diner, and he puts out like his own music and things like that. But he always talks about how, like, when you're on like Twitter or Facebook, and you're sharing somebody's independent project, there's kind of it's a little bit different than if you're sharing some famous person's like political tweet or something like that, right? That you're just sort of signal boosting something. It doesn't really take a lot to do it, but the appreciation that comes from the people that are producing the work to have it be signal boosted is so much greater than that celebrity who doesn't really care if you retweet their angry political rant or whatever. And I think the same thing from a financial standpoint, that like, giving money to a crowd, a crowdfunding campaign or Kickstarter campaign for a movie, that money is kind of appreciated on a level that spending that same money to rent a movie on cable or something like that, it doesn't quite have that same level. Unless of course you're supporting independent film when you're renting the movie, but there is it sort of has a greater importance than just the money itself. I think that the people involved being able to use that money to get their vision across is always really important.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, donating to the campaign, you are almost paying for the movie in a way. But when that film's out there on potentially subscription platforms or AVOD, you're watching the movie for free anyway. So I guess to the people that put the money into the campaign, you're probably going to be able to watch the movie for free at some point anyway. So it's not like you're going to pay for it twice, if that makes sense. At least that's the way that I see it.
But the money that you're putting in up front like that does kind of have it's sort of like it means something for the creation of the film. So you can almost kind of watch and be like, hey, I put something towards this, and look at the film that's there now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's probably no greater level of support than that for filmmakers, certainly from like the filmmaking community and from audiences, to actually to put money into something, especially in times where things are obviously difficult economically and whatever, without getting too political. But yeah, I mean, people are struggling for money. So anything obviously that people put towards the campaign is massively appreciated by not just myself and Tom, but everyone else, the cast and crew that want to make the film.
Yeah, again, we've got levels of perks and things. So I mean, some people who might have a bit more to spare, who kind of have aspirations to kind of jump into the film industry, we've got certain perks where you can get credits, whether it's just a thank you credit or producer credit. So we've got options like that available. But if it's just the price of a cup of coffee that you want to give, that's fair enough. Or even just sharing it to spread the word. We appreciate all kind of help, really.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing too, like you said, like, sometimes financially people don't always have the money to be able to give, but I think people don't realize even the importance of signal boosting. That, like, I think that's another thing that John Cross has mentioned. Like, he'll post an album and his friends won't like it on Facebook, and they're like, well, John, we like your music. He's like, but yeah, if you like it, it informs the algorithm that it starts to appear on more people's pages, and there is an importance in that like the more people that like it, retweet it, that kind of thing, it more people can see it, more other people that will start to see it, and so there is an importance in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you see things on Facebook and whatnot a lot of the time about supporting people's businesses or endeavors, and I think that is very important. Yeah. Especially in this day and age when a lot of things get lost or swallowed up on social media, and unfortunately you are at the mercy of the algorithms on Facebook, and what it thinks that people want to see.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, anything, people, I think, signal boosting, but then yeah, and if you've got the money to financially support, I think those are all really important things. So yeah, and then I think, as we're wrapping up here, if people haven't seen When Darkness Falls yet, here in the States, a lot of different streamers have it. So, Tubi has it, Roku channel has it, Vudu has it, Peacock. So a lot of places that you can find that. So definitely people should be checking that out. But then the Kickstarter campaign for Baby in a Basket, that definitely check that out as well. All right, excellent. Well, before we wrap up, anything else from either of you on either film?
I don't think so. Just thank you very much for having us. That was a great chat. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, same. Yeah, always good fun, Matt. Thanks for having us on again.
Absolutely. Thank you both for coming on, and the best of luck. I'm excited to kind of see how the film turns out.
Cheers, man. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you both for coming on, and everybody, thank you for listening. And yeah, we'll be back soon. Bye, everyone.